Chapter 241. Collateral Damage. Countless footfalls broke the oppressive silence of the night as dozens of men marched through the fields. They moved as quietly as they could, but there was only so much such a large group could do to mask their presence. Most of them were doomed to die tonight, though they didn't seem to care about that, continuing their journey as if it was any other day. Only their leader had his brow creased, various thoughts swirling within his tired mind. Every now and then, he glanced at the letter in his hands, examining the order that had led him to such a risky move. To Archibald, Patriarch of House Avalon, you are hereby ordered to present yourself at the Alchemists Guild within the next 2 weeks, to answer for your involvement in withholding the Aurora Dew's recipe from the Divine Order. Furthermore, you are accused of severe negligence at best or sedition at worst, as one of the Divine Roots field agents has gone missing inside your family's territory. Failure to comply will be considered an admission of guilt and evidence of rebellion. Suffice to say, your penalty will be far more severe in such circumstances and will extend to the rest of your house. Deimos, envoy of the Divine Root. He sighed. At least, the fact that they wanted him to turn himself in, coupled with Percy's wanted posters circulating around Remir, were good signs that his grandson had evaded capture. But he had to show up at the guild. That much was unavoidable, and his odds of walking out of there a free man weren't that great. This was why he'd decided to do one last thing for his family, to place House Avalon in a better spot in the years to come. It's about time, he thought, glancing at the enemy's headquarters. Strictly speaking, this was something he'd considered doing many times before. But a family's patriarch couldn't easily leave their territory, lest they left their house open to attack. Luckily, their circumstances had changed a little over the past few months. Galahad not only had circulation now, but even a brand new acid affinity. And he had already opened the new channels, even though he'd yet to extend the boosting art to all of them. Archibald was more confident leaving his son in charge of the family, trusting in his ability to hold his own even against a Violet if it came to it. This was why he'd even dared to leave the mansion, but he couldn't possibly leave the Camelot province entirely. Not without dealing with House Tantalus once and for all. Go, he muttered softly. The others in his company spread out, circling the enemy headquarters from every direction. Naturally, these weren't real people, each of them sporting an appearance identical to his own. They were his clones, 120 of them in total. Watching them move, he took a deep breath after another, a series of verdant lines lighting up on his skin, swirling around like vines. No room for mistakes, he sighed, his expression grim. His objectives were set in stone. He had to exterminate House Tantalus tonight, forever purging this cancer from his family's territory. And he couldn't leave any witnesses behind, or news of circulation would spread around like wildfire, drawing even more trouble to their province. A couple of scouts spotted his clones. There were too many of them to hide. Sadly for the nobles, however, Archibald had spotted them much earlier. And the speed of his troops wasn't a joke, covering dozens of meters with each stride. Expertly positioning the clones like chess pieces, he swiftly took out the younger mages before they even got a chance to signal back to their family. Soon enough, his army invaded through every door and every window in the building, dispatching anyone they encountered in the process. Controlling so many bodies at once was a monumental task, but he'd had centuries to master his bloodline. The first few seconds went by without a hitch, most of the enemies being fast asleep this late at night. Yet, it was inevitable that something would go wrong eventually. A single clone sported the physique of a Violet, but it couldn't use magic. Even a green should be able to hold their own against them, especially given how many he had to control. Once the first person survived the ambush, everything went downhill. The tale has been stolen. If detected on Amazon, report the violation. Enemy attack! A panicked scream pierced through the bloodshed, alerting the rest of the nobles. It didn't take long for the mansion to light up in all sorts of colors, the family's greens and blues engaging his clones in battle. Archibald clicked his tongue, but he maintained his focus, having expected this. At first, he held the upper hand. Carried by their momentum, His clones continued to advance deeper into the building, laying waste to its unfortunate residents. But his opponents eventually regained their bearing. Eventually, the first clone fell, and then the second, the fifth, the 20th. Brotees himself, a fellow Violet, slaughtered a dozen of them with ease, his lieutenants not falling far behind. Gritting his teeth, Archibald poured more mana into his troops, activating a spell. The clones' heartbeats sped up, as veins and arteries bulged like roots all over their skin. Their movements grew faster, their attacks more forceful, as they stared at their opponents with bloodshot eyes. Archibald would have used this from the start if he could, but he didn't want to waste it until they were deep inside the mansion. After all, the clones wouldn't last more than a few minutes under this boost. The high-ranking nobles were instantly on the back foot again. The first blue died not long after the spell took effect, a second joining him a couple minutes later. The yellows who had grouped up to keep the clones at bay were instantly outmatched. Soon, only greens or higher remained alive. Before long, a thick crimson mist spilled out of the mansion, the stench of iron reaching Archibald, who stood 100 meters away. But it wasn't his clones walking out alive a few minutes later. It was the enemy nobles. "I didn't think you had it in you, to be honest," Brotees said, his face grim. "But I suppose this is the world we live in, isn't it?" Archibald didn't reply. His gut churned at the atrocity he'd just committed, and he knew he wasn't even done yet. But he didn't regret it. It was either them or his family, and House Tantalus had already proven themselves more than willing to do the same. By now, only 15 people stood in the enemy ranks. Brotees, 2 blues and 12 greens. All the weaklings had already perished. After the severe losses they'd suffered over the last couple of years, catching them by surprise in the middle of the night had been the final nail in the coffin. "It's over now," Brotees said. "At the end of the day, it's still our victory, isn't it? You'll die tonight, Archibald. You'll die screaming, after you spill the beans on that weird spell boosting your magic. Then, I'll wait for the divine root to crush your family, before rebuilding my own from the ashes." Archibald sighed, allowing circulation to fizzle out, plopping down weakly. "If you wanted to do any of that, you should have held your breath." Brotees raised an eyebrow, though his confusion didn't last long. A loud, wet cough drew his attention, as he jerked his head towards one of the surviving greens. The man was on his knees, blood pouring like a waterfall from every orifice on his face. "What the—" He barely got to ask the question when a second man met the same fate, followed by a third. By the time he turned back to Archibald, one of the blues had collapsed too, the greens already spasming in agony. Violent streams of mana gushed out of Brotees's pores like rivers, blending into a raging lake around him. It grew and stabilized as it mixed with his domain, threatening to cover the entire battlefield. However, he never got the chance to use it, as a wave of vertigo slammed into his head too, causing him to lose control of his mana, the water splashing out harmlessly. "Didn't you think it a little strange that I sent over half my clones after you?" Archibald asked. The man's eyes widened in realization. Had Archibald wanted to maximize his odds of victory, he should have kept the clones as far from him as possible. Shouldn't he? Only after taking out all his underlings should he have tried to outnumber a fellow Violet. Unless he had something else in mind. Getting up, Archibald walked towards Brotees, reading the notification flashing before his eyes. "Congratulations! Your spell has evolved. Secret Art. Vector of Disease. Masterful - Secret Art. Plaguebringer. Masterful." Naturally, he'd had his secret art for centuries already, though this was the first time he got to use it at such a large scale. Not to mention how much stronger it had grown, thanks to circulation and the vastly increased number of clones. Brotees's spell crumbled, as he started bleeding too. He seemed to have accepted his fate, after seeing the last of his men die. "Mind answering a question before you finish me?" Brotees asked. "Just where the hell did you learn this spell? I've never even heard of anything like it." Archibald shrugged. "I'll tell you if you answer a few questions of my own," he replied, getting a nod back. Remember that massacre you ordered a couple decades ago? Brotees frowned. Are you seriously cough, trying to claim the moral high ground after what you've just done tonight? That's not it, Archibald said, not bothering to explain. Sure. The man spat. There was an opportunity to deal a blow to your family, and I took it. I didn't think much of it. What's even the big deal? If I'm not mistaken, we only managed to take a few Redborns out that time. Didn't we? Just collateral damage, he said, visibly holding back another coughing fit. Archibald nodded. Well, my grandson is the one who taught me the spell. The same grandson the divine root is after. Brotees laughed, but it came out gurgled. You're kidding, right? Isn't he just a Redborn runt? Reaching Brotees, Archibald looked down at him. He stared into his eyes, his expression cold as an iceberg. He was lucky enough to escape that massacre, but his parents weren't. I'm sure he'd be glad to know I used circulation to take down your family. But that wasn't what he was thinking about when he taught me the spell. The man's smile soured at the sound of that, but Archibald continued, right as the light finally left Brotees's eyes. You were just collateral damage. Chapter 242. Infinite Powder Cheat. What are you even doing? Elaine asked after Percy nearly stumbled on a pebble. He shrugged. If this works, I'll never have to condense another crystal in my life. It was still dark, the trio walking towards the next town, the crow flying nearby. But Percy didn't pay much attention to where he stepped, busy with something more important. He held a small teal rod in his hand. It looked like his scythe's shaft, but it was only the length of his finger. And he was currently carving an enchantment on the middle section, a rather intricate one at that. Behold, ladies and gentle crow, I present you the infinite powder cheat, he exclaimed once he was done, pouring some fused mana into the runes. Sadly, by the time his companions turned to look at him, a wisp of smoke had come out of the enchantment, the darn thing having barely blinked once before getting fried. Not seeing it, Nesha joked, a smug grin plastered all over her face. Whatever, just give me another hour or so. Percy rolled his eyes, crushing the construct into powder before beginning the process anew. Originally, he'd bought the self-repair enchantment mainly for his armor's maintenance. However, he'd drawn some inspiration while reading the book, thinking of another potential application. He wasn't completely sure it would work, but he couldn't see a reason for it not to either. If it did, it would save him several hours of manual labor per day. The girls didn't say anything else, allowing him to work in silence. It wasn't until about an hour later that he held a new rod, engraved with a hopefully functional self-repair enchantment this time. To avoid embarrassing himself again, he made sure the runes worked before speaking up. Ahem. After some technical difficulties, I'm pleased to present you with the infinite powder cheat, he said again, this time with more confidence. I get the lack of smoke is supposed to be a good thing, but it still looks like a rod to me, Elaine said. Percy grinned. Pinching one end of the construct between his thumb and index finger, he used his willpower to chip a fragment off, shattering it into powder. He didn't get that much, barely enough to fill a teaspoon, but this could easily be scaled up. Next, he fused some more of his mana, pouring it into the enchantment again. Unlike before, the runes guzzled down the teal mana even more eagerly, the rod shining a little brighter. First, nothing happened. Nesha was about to open her mouth again, but she swallowed whatever she was about to say when the broken section of the rod started growing back. A few seconds later, the construct was as good as new. This is definitely impressive, though isn't it a little slow? Elaine asked. Nesha was the one to come to his rescue this time, however. It's much better than his old approach. In the past, each marble took Percy around 7 minutes. 7 exhausting minutes of intense focus. And he needed one of those marbles for each dose of elixir he wanted to convert into Aurora Dew. In other words, while each brewing session only took about 15 minutes in and of itself, he needed to spend 28 minutes condensing crystals beforehand. All in all, nearly 2/3 of his daily chores were wasted on crystallization. This is several times faster already. And that's without optimizing the shape of the construct or the size of the enchantment. I haven't used synchronization either. Not to mention that this is downright effortless. After I fine-tune everything, I'll be able to pour my mana into it as we travel and get all the powder I want. Unauthorized use of content. If you find this story on Amazon, report the violation. Elaine whistled, finally realizing how massive this was. Just like that, Percy had removed over 2 hours of grueling work from his daily schedule. Or, well, he would once they found the rainbow grass equivalent he needed. For now, let's just improve the construct. What do you guys think? He asked, holding a strange contraption up for all to see. It was a teal bust of a crow, about as large as Percy's fist. A self-repair enchantment had been engraved on the base of its neck, this one over thrice as wide as the one he'd drawn on the rod. A glowing gemstone was held in its beak, attached on both sides. It was as large as the marbles Percy usually made. Nesha squinted to shield her eyes from the sunlight as she examined the object. It was already late in the morning. Looks tacky. I like it. It's cute. Elaine disagreed. Either way, the aesthetics didn't matter much as long as it did its job. Percy grabbed the gemstone, snapping it out of the beak. Next, he poured his mana into the enchantment, watching a new gemstone grow in real time, several times faster than before. 23 seconds, he exclaimed once the new gemstone was complete, more than satisfied with the result. And he wasn't the only one satisfied, apparently. Congratulations! You have mastered a new spell. Spirit-Forged Effigy? Refined. Registering his 11th refined spell was no small feat, though he was a bit too tired to enjoy it. Keeping up with the others on foot was tougher on him due to his lower grade, and he'd spent the whole night experimenting with the enchantment. Do you want to take a break? Elaine asked, noticing he was out of breath. Nah, we've already lost too much time. I'd rather get to the next town as soon as possible. She didn't seem very convinced, still looking at him with concern. But she kept her thoughts to herself, respecting his wishes. He sighed. It wasn't like he didn't want to rest, but he couldn't afford to. This whole divine root fiasco was bound to blow in their faces sooner or later, and he needed to progress as much as possible until then. His spells aside, he had to reach yellow too. No slacking for me. Shifting his attention elsewhere, his eyes landed on the ethereal cord in his abdomen. This one was connected to his most recent clone, yet he could still perceive it via his mutation. It appeared the evolution of his secret art affected all his cords, not just the one linking him to his familiar. Does that mean I can use soul resonance with my clones too? If he could communicate or even exchange mana with them from farther away, it would open so many new doors. His clones would all have access to an endless supply of teal mana, in addition to whatever their host's affinities were. He could use that as a trump card in the vault, and who knew where else? Then again, he wasn't sure if it was possible. Strictly speaking, he didn't even know how far his connection could currently reach, let alone if he could extend that. No harm in trying, I suppose. Gathering as much fused mana as he could, he forcefully pushed it through the cord, trying to widen it. The connection did expand slightly as the packet of mana coursed through it, though it snapped back to its previous size a moment later. Not that strange, given how Percy's new spell worked. I guess I'll need the clone to cooperate with me from the other side. Sadly, it was a little late to discuss that with, well, himself. He'd have to wait a couple days for the clone to return before planning ahead for the next one. In the meantime, he could experiment with his familiar. Hey, Mickey, do you want to play around with that thing from yesterday? Right now? The response was a little lethargic. The crow wasn't doing much better than he was, having to fly while keeping regulation up. Come on, it'll only take a few minutes to expand the cord. It's much easier to keep it open afterwards. Fine. The bird groaned. Percy repeated his earlier actions, this time sending an orb of mana to his familiar. The cord expanded for a moment, before trying to shrink again. Mickey didn't allow it, however, bouncing the mana back. The two kept at it for a while, soon managing to return their connection to its empowered state. The resistance seemed to vanish entirely, as the mana began to flow more smoothly through it, their thoughts threatening to spill out against their will. "Awesome," Percy muttered, having watched the entire process with his eyes this time. The mana wasn't detectable with mana sense while passing through the cord. Percy was confident the connection wasn't located in the physical plane. Perhaps it used the soul plane, or maybe something even more esoteric. Still, it was nice to confirm they could indeed tap into this ability at will. He was tempted to play around with Mickey's ice mana, but he figured he'd bugged the poor bird enough for today. With nothing better to do, he grabbed the effigy from his pocket. He might as well switch his brain off and work on his powder stash as they traveled. Chapter 243. Unforeseen Developments. It took them an entire week to reach the next town. The good news was that bandits never bothered them anymore, probably thanks to Elaine being in the group. Nothing like a green to ward lowlifes off. Then again, Mickey might have preferred to have a snack or two step forward of their own volition. Either way, it had been a fruitful few days, despite the detour. Percy gradually filled his jar up with powder, one gemstone at a time. He now had more than enough to reforge his armor, after getting some well-deserved rest, of course. He even convinced the crow to let him play around with his ice mana for a couple hours, offering him a chance to do the same with his own affinities in return. Accessing each other's cores from afar presented an additional layer of difficulty, on top of just familiarizing themselves with the new mana types. It was still a work in progress, but Percy hoped they could eventually learn a couple of combination spells. It'll make for quite a trump card if we can get it to work. In some ways, it'll be like having 4 cores. The clone also returned about 2 days in. Percy sent 3 more clones since, this time instructing each of them to help him practice his soul resonance spell. Sadly, the first was a complete dud in that regard. Trying to establish a connection with the main body caused him to return to Remir ahead of time by accident. It was a tricky business, as the clones had to strengthen the cord before wandering too far. Unfortunately, doing so also strengthened the force pulling them home. Luckily, the next clone did a little better. He managed to reinforce the connection without getting dragged back in the process. He even possessed a horse-like beast on some alien world while communicating with Percy. Admittedly, it required a lot of effort from both of them to maintain the link, probably due to the extreme distances involved. Neither of them could do much else, or the cord would shrink back to its original shape without any way for them to restore it. "I guess we'll just have to practice with it until it becomes second nature." It wouldn't be his first spell that started off difficult to use, only to get easier with training. Either way, this was proof of concept that soul resonance would help him in the long run. His bloodline was the source of all his strength, so any improvements to his clone's abilities were by far the most important. At any rate, Percy tried something special with the third and final clone. They did manage to empower their connection at first, and he tried to take advantage of that to direct the clone to a specific place. Sadly, the connection got severed soon afterwards, probably because the clone wandered a bit too far. Percy had no idea if he'd reached his intended destination, but the clone was still out 3 days later, so he was confident he'd found something interesting, at least. Suffice to say, the whole group was completely exhausted as they reached the town, Percy even more so than the others. He and Nesha were the first to enter the inn as they were in dire need of some shut-eye. Once again, Elaine volunteered to stay in the outskirts with Mickey. Percy hated that his cousin always drew the short end of the stick, but it couldn't be helped. Her higher grade meant she could handle a lot more than them before reaching her breaking point. "Percy, wake up!" Mickey cawed through the cord. Percy groaned, but he didn't let his complaints leak back to his familiar. He was the one who'd asked the bird to wake him up after sleeping for a few hours, so that he could take over Elaine's post. He knew he would have slept for over a day if left alone. Gently lifting Nesha's arm from his chest, he got up as slowly as he could, trying not to disturb her. His brain still throbbed rather painfully, his feet feeling like mush. He ignored all that, tossing his clothes back on. He was about to leave the room when his girlfriend spoke. "If you stumble upon this tale on Amazon, it's taken without the author's consent. Report it." "Ugh! How long have we slept?" she asked in a raspy voice. He sighed. Apparently, he'd woken her up, despite his efforts not to. 3 hours? Maybe 4? He guessed, looking out of the window. She remained silent for a second, letting the words sink in. All right, I'll go check out the marketplace before it closes for the night. Maybe we'll get luckier this time. Percy nodded. They were already cutting it close. It had been early in the afternoon when they arrived, so she'd have to go now. That said, he didn't really expect her to find any deattunement ingredients, as those were much rarer outside the guild. And there was a good reason for that too. Pacification reagents like pale carrots, moonflower petals, and crystal tulips typically contained ice mana. This was how they delayed the activation rate of other ingredients. It also meant they had several uses outside alchemy, making for excellent coolants to preserve food with, or to alleviate heat during the summer. This was why Percy had found a few in his family's warehouse, and why they'd been able to buy some from the last town too. When it came to deattunement, however, their odds weren't great, especially considering the sheer volume of ingredients that they required to consistently meet their elixir needs. Oh well, I suppose we don't lose much by checking. The two left the inn, walking to the town square together. The idea was for him to accompany Nesha there before leaving the town. Fate had other plans for them, however. Once more, they encountered a lot of atypical commotion, much like the last town. Unlike before, they didn't catch sight of the Divine Roots men directly, though they did hear some curious whispers. "Is there really a holy child in our town?" one of the townsfolk asked. "He just got here about an hour ago," another replied. "Are you sure you didn't mistake a regular noble?" "No way, man. Do you think I'm an idiot? He's a young boy, younger than your son. At Blue. And he has 5 guards from the Divine Root with him." "Again? Seriously?" Nesha asked, her features twisting into a grimace. Percy turned to Nesha, giving her an odd look. "I thought you said they are headed to the Thirsty Valley." "They are," she insisted. "We've heard it from multiple sources. Most of them heard it directly from them." Percy frowned. This made no sense whatsoever. They'd deliberately strayed off course to avoid them. Why would anyone traveling to the Thirsty Valley pass through here? It was objectively a horrible route, adding multiple weeks to the journey. Nesha appeared just as perplexed as him, not having a good explanation. Thinking of something, she gasped. "Do you think they're here for us? Maybe somebody recognized us from the posters." It wasn't impossible. There was only so much a beard and a pair of glowing eyes could do to mask one's appearance. Then again, there were several problems with this idea too. Let's not jump to conclusions. We stood right in front of them in the previous town, but nobody moved to arrest us. One of them even glanced at me. And why would they send a holy child after us? Has the Divine Root run out of people? Maybe the holy child is the only karma user they could find? Nesha offered an explanation, but Percy shook his head. "I checked all their cores. He has a mud affinity. The others are all common." Nesha raised an eyebrow. "Either way, this can't be a coincidence. We intentionally steered clear of them, and here they are." "You're right," he nodded. "There's definitely something fishy going on. Here's what we'll do." After explaining his plan to Nesha, he reached out to Mickey and Elaine, bringing them up to speed. The idea was for them to leave quietly during the night, much like before. However, they'd do a couple of things differently this time. They would head the opposite way to their destination. If the Holy Child chased them again, they would know for certain they were being followed. Furthermore, they wouldn't travel together this time. The plan was to split up into 2 groups. They'd still meet up in Goldenfield Town, but they'd approach from different directions. Mickey and Elaine would do so from the west, while Percy and Nesha would enter from the east. This way, the groups would still be able to communicate via the ethereal cord, and they could also narrow down the Holy Child's target, depending on which group they ended up chasing. "I could have used some sleep," Elaine smiled wryly. In the end, she never got to rest. Sighing, Percy handed her 6 healing potions from his amulet. He generally avoided wasting them unless it was an emergency, but they might help a little given the circumstances. It wasn't perfect. Her grade would greatly mute the potion's effects. Not to mention that life mana alone couldn't do much about her mental fatigue. Still, it might keep her going for a couple more days. The two groups bid each other farewell, leaving in opposite directions. Perhaps this really was just one big coincidence and Percy was being paranoid. But his gut told him they wouldn't be this lucky. Chapter 244. Acton. Acton picked a branch off the ground, sniffing the broken end a couple of times before tossing it aside. The scent was there, but it was faint, more so than usual. "Gone again," he muttered, a grimace marring his face. There was no doubt his target had spent some time here. But Acton was a few days late. The trail was already rather obscure, vaguely pointing south. A direction most inconvenient. "Pack your stuff. We're leaving for Goldenfield Town in an hour," he said, turning to his guards. Their expressions soured at the sound of that, as they gave him and each other uncertain looks. They had no idea what he was even doing, but they clearly weren't happy with his command. Eventually, the most senior of them summoned the courage to step forward. He bowed politely before speaking. "Your Radiance, we cannot do that. Our orders were to escort you to the Thirsty Valley. We've already wasted too much time. Goldenfield Town is located exactly opposite to our destination." Acton clicked his tongue. "You'll go exactly where I tell you to go. This is as important to me as my corps' advancement," he spat, unleashing his domain on the man. The guard, Acton couldn't recall his name, instantly fell to his knees. Pathetic. Acton knew his domain wasn't nearly strong enough to subjugate a green. The fool was faking it to placate him. He thought he wouldn't notice. Lifting the pressure, Acton turned away. Such trash the Root had sent to accompany him. All of them showering him with praise, treating him like the holiest existence to his face. As they should, of course. But behind his back, they constantly plotted to manipulate him, treating him like a child. Then again, he didn't really care about the opinions of these ants. His gaze was locked elsewhere, on the people residing in that place. Compared to the rest of Remier, the Order's numbers were just a drop in the bucket. A few thousand people standing above everyone else. Each of them a priceless treasure to this world. But gathered in one place, that was still a lot of them. And Acton was at the bottom of the barrel there. Compared to his peers, at least, the only people who truly mattered. After all, so many of them had powerful bloodlines or rare affinities. A few of the older ones had even inherited blessings from the gods themselves. Meanwhile, what did he have? Just a shitty mud affinity and a weak bloodline. At least, he'd been able to upgrade the useless earth affinity he'd been born with thanks to the petal, though he couldn't use it properly just yet. The best he could do was to split it up to use his old earth spells. Regardless, it wasn't enough. He'd never be important in that place, not unless he grew stronger. This was why he'd even asked to be escorted to the Thirsty Valley. The sooner he reached Violet, the better. Sighing, he opened his status again. Undersir. Acton Parnassus. Mana Core. A Mana Core, Blue Mud. Bloodline. Beastmaster. Sense and subjugate beasts. Spells. A Stone Palace, refined. A Earthen Grasp, refined. Undersir. On paper, the ability to control beasts was among the most powerful a mage could ask for. After all, they grew faster than any human could. With sufficient preparation and proper guidance, one should be able to cultivate an entire army of creatures stronger than themselves. In theory, at least. This was precisely why House Parnassus had received so much attention back when they first manifested the bloodline, tens of thousands of years ago. Even the gods had taken notice, pouring resources into their family, placing them under their protection. The story has been stolen. If detected on Amazon, report the violation. Consequently, Acton's house was one of the oldest ones still standing. At one point, they'd even been a great house, propped to that level artificially rather than by their own merits. Such a pity the bloodline failed to evolve. It was the ability's potential that had brought on all this interest, not its true power. Every registered permutation had been riddled with drawbacks, making it completely impractical. The most serious problem was that it could only be used on beasts weaker than oneself. What good was a green beast to a blue? It would barely help in a fight. Perhaps things would have been different if multiple beasts could be subjugated at once. Sadly, only one could be controlled at a time. Adding the sheer cost and effort required to feed and train the beasts, and the bloodline just wasn't worth the trouble in its current state. Still, the gods had kept their support up for a while. Century after century, they had waited, hoping for a mutation to occur, for a version of the bloodline devoid of such restrictions to emerge. All of it in vain. Once, a promising scion had been born with the ability to tame multiple beasts. Not that many, but still worth exploring further. Unfortunately, that had come at the cost of lowering the subjugated beast's grade by another step, making this version of the bloodline even weaker than the rest. Efforts had been made to breed that individual with others, to mutate the strain again. Dead ends. By now, the house was deemed as a lost cause, left alone to wither. Other families still avoided touching them, afraid of the order's retaliation. But the members of House Parnassus understood the truth. Their bloodline would never evolve, and it just wasn't good enough for them to thrive with it. Not in their barren lands. Not without the gods' support. Nowadays, they weren't even considered a great house anymore, lacking a white to lead. Of course, Acton didn't care about any of that. Not his family's status, nor their history. He was a greenborn. He belonged elsewhere. But he did care that he was stuck with such a useless bloodline. I need to find this creature, wherever it is. Such a stroke of luck, to pass through the whistling woods on the way to the thirsty valley. The sensory side of his bloodline wasn't particularly powerful either. It relied on lingering sense and other subtle hints to grant him a subconscious understanding of his target, pointing him towards it. It wasn't very informative nor very accurate, though the few things he did learn had been more than enough to pique his interest. The beast he'd caught wind of was unique in all the best ways. It was only at yellow, but it left behind an atypical presence. Acton couldn't tell how or why, but it was far stronger than it had any right to be. At first, this had confused him. It had left him in doubt, uncertain of whether this was even a beast at all. Maybe it was just a person with a weird bloodline? But the broken branches didn't lie. It was a beast, a bird specifically, a little inconvenient, as it spent a lot of time airborne, leaving fewer traces for him to track. In any case, he had to capture it. It might not be enough to elevate his status in the order, but it was the best lead he had. Sure, its low grade was annoying. He'd have to raise it to green, and later to blue once he advanced himself. Then again, it was a small price to pay. It would only take some time. Hell, Acton would raise a province to the ground to feed it if that's what it took. How the hell is it avoiding me, though? It made no sense. The darn thing had already done it twice. Acton had stayed in Gentlebreeze town for days, spending every morning and every afternoon scouring the surroundings in search of the creature. By the time he homed into that lake, the beast had been gone for a while. The first time could have been a coincidence, but it happened again. It must have left this place half a week ago. Was it working with humans? Impossible. He'd never heard of another bloodline like his. There shouldn't be anyone on Remir capable of taming a yellow beast. Well, other than my family, did one of my relatives get to it first? He wondered, creasing his brow. It was quite a stretch. His family's province was located very far from here. But this was the only explanation he could think of. It would explain everything. His relatives would have recognized him in the town. Then they'd leave, afraid he would snatch their treasured minion from them. He shrugged. It was annoying, but they couldn't outrun him forever. His bloodline's tracking ability grew stronger the more information he gathered about his target. It was only a matter of time until he caught up. If they think I'll show mercy because of our shared blood, they're sorely mistaken. How dare they defy him? Those ungrateful relics should be groveling at his feet, offering him the beast of their own volition. After all, Acton was the best thing to have happened to their rotting family in centuries. It was thanks to him that the Order had rewarded them so handsomely, despite their countless failures. That trinket they got could level a whole town once detonated. No sense thinking about them, I suppose. If they're truly involved, I'll find out soon enough. Shaking his head, he headed off, his guards hurrying behind him. Some of them still voiced their protests, but he ignored them. If they kept yapping, he might have to kill one of them to remind them of their place. He'd get reprimanded for it later, but it wouldn't be more than a slap on the wrist. A small price to pay to make sure these fools stopped arguing with him. This was what it meant to be one of the chosen few. A holy child. Chapter 245. Under Pressure. Percy's hands shook as he tried to mold his mana into the correct shape. This was already his third attempt, but the construct crumbled into powder about halfway through, the fine dust spilling between his trembling fingers. "Come on, not again," he groaned, nearly slamming his fist on the table. Nesha placed her hand on his wrist, giving it a gentle squeeze. "This isn't helping. You need to calm down." He looked at her in a daze for a couple seconds, letting the words sink in. Eventually, he placed his other hand on top of hers, nodding. They had no idea if the Holy Child would follow them to Goldenfield Town. It was just speculation on their part. Perhaps they were wrong about the whole thing. Maybe the last couple of towns had been a coincidence. Or maybe the boy just wouldn't bother venturing even farther from his destination for their sake, whatever it was he wanted. Regardless, Percy couldn't leave it up to chance. This was why he'd kept circulation active throughout the journey, risking being seen by a passerby, just to reach the town a couple days sooner, to give himself some extra time to prepare. "If he does follow us, I need to have this done." "I know, but you should try taking a deep breath first." Healing potions were a poor substitute for sleep, but the group had still been forced to guzzle them down one after the other like crazy to keep going. By now, they'd already wasted about a third of Percy's stash, and they didn't have much to show for it. Still, he had to make the most of his time, to reforge his armor. It might not protect him much from the Holy Child, but, at least, he wouldn't be as defenseless when it came to his guards. Of course, he'd much rather avoid fighting altogether. Sadly, he had no idea if that would even be possible. Listening to Nesha's advice, Percy inhaled deeply, forcing himself to relax. She was right. He couldn't do this with his hands trembling. Whether it was due to the exhaustion or the stress, he had to rein himself in first. A few minutes later, he grabbed another handful of powder from his jar. The good news was that he had plenty, courtesy of his new spell. But the actual process of crafting the phantom scale raiment was very time-consuming in and of itself. He'd had a lot of practice over the last year, but he still wasn't sure whether he could rebuild all the pieces in the next 2 days. Clearing his mind, he began fusing the soft mana with the powder, forming the intermediate materials he needed for the armor. "If I'm going to do this, I should do it right. After all, it's going to stick around this time." Thanks to the self-repair enchantment. Once he had all the materials ready, he blended them together into the toughest alloy he'd discovered through his experiments, before shaping it into a finger guard. Or, well, a piece of one. "All right, at least it didn't break this time," he exhaled in relief, flicking the glowing construct twice for good measure. Next, he set his eyes on its interior, carving the growth and memory runes on top of one another. This was one of the hardest parts, as a single mistake would force him to start over. Only once the enchantment had been drawn without errors did he fill the empty space with some more reinforced mana, visualizing the intended effect in his mind. "Did it work?" Nesha asked. "Let's find out," he shrugged. Chipping a piece off the corner of the construct, he fed some more of his fused mana into the enchantment, watching the finger guard repair itself soon enough. Nodding in satisfaction, he then began to engrave the second enchantment on the outer side of the object. This piece was supposed to go in the innermost layer of his armor. In the past, he'd engraved the absorption runes on it, using the hardness runes for the middle layer and the concealment runes for the outer layer. This time, he was planning to do things a little differently, however. He wanted to use his newfound knowledge of Magiscript to stack more than one enchantment on each piece. This book was originally published on Royal Road. Check it out there for the real experience. "Let's see. I want both a hardness and absorption rune here," he thought, trying to overlap the symbols. A true composite enchantment, like self-repair, required one to simultaneously visualize both the joint effect and the effects of its components. Unfortunately, Percy didn't know of any enchantments involving this specific pair of runes. Still, based on the things he'd read, it should be possible to consolidate the two symbols into one pseudo-enchantment. It wouldn't do anything extra, just whatever the runes did separately. That said, it would take less space to draw, allowing Percy to shoehorn both onto the piece. About half an hour later, he was done, marveling at the completed construct. Against all odds, the patchwork of runes had worked on the first try too, saving him some precious time. "One piece down," he said, though he instinctively slapped his forehead the very next moment, realizing he'd messed up. "Shit! What's wrong?" Nesha asked. Percy sighed. It was easier to show her. Picking the construct up again, he poured more of his fused mana into the self-repair enchantment. Soon, the material lodged into the other runes got pushed out, the engraved symbols slowly closing, like a wound in the process of healing. The other runes have to be engraved first, or the self-repair enchantment will erase them automatically. Damn, and I kept reminding myself to be careful about this. I guess the lack of sleep is getting to me. With a heavy heart, Percy destroyed the object again, starting over for the 5th time. Unfortunately, the self-repair enchantment failed to activate during his next attempt, the hardness rune messing up the one after. By the time Percy managed to craft the construct perfectly, it had already been around 2 hours. "Not good enough," he spat, his features twisting into a grimace. "I've still got dozens of pieces. At this rate, it'll take me a full week." "I'm sure you'll pick up the pace. Just concentrate," Nesha said, handing him 2 more potions. Percy didn't argue, gulping down the green liquid. On any other day, he might have found the minty flavor refreshing. Right now, it only served as a bitter reminder that he was pouring the potions down the drain. At least, the life mana relieved the tension in his eyelids, lifting the sting off his eyes. Still, his brain felt just as fried as it had 5 minutes ago. Sighing, he grabbed another handful of powder, starting work on the second piece. "Let's get this one done in under an hour. No room for mistakes." Minutes became hours, and hours became days. As Percy continued rebuilding his armor one piece at a time, he ignored the light seeping through the curtains, sometimes the bright rays of the sun, others the soft glimmer of the moon. His mind focused on the crafting process alone. At first, he made several mistakes, most of them when drawing the self-repair enchantment, but occasionally the forging process went wrong too. Still, he got better with each piece, handing them to Nesha one after the other. Stacking them onto a pile, she never stopped encouraging him and giving him more potions whenever she felt like he needed them. At the same time, their hearts kept racing, constantly afraid that Mickey would reach out, informing them the divine root was here. Luckily, that never happened. In the end, Percy managed to complete the entire armor, confirming that every single enchantment worked as it was meant to. "One last thing I need to do," he said, gathering some more of the teal powder. This time, he allowed his spectral trait to take over, spinning the mana into a thread. It wasn't nearly thin enough to weave a fabric out of. Percy estimated that goal was still years away, but that didn't mean it was useless. It was good enough to fasten the armor pieces together, replacing the need for the soft mana. That way, Percy wouldn't have to constantly exert himself to hold everything together, which would allow him to better focus on the fight at hand. Even better, the threads would be stronger, making it much harder for the spell to come apart. "But how are you going to add the self-repair enchantment on the strings?" Nesha asked. "I won't. I'll have to replace them every few days. Still better than reforging the whole armor or having to manually hold it in place," he explained. As soon as he was done, he tossed the new strings atop the pile of his armor before climbing onto the bed. Overall, he'd made several changes to the spell, whether it was the shape of the armor, the reinforced strings, or the upgraded runes. There was no doubt in his mind it was a great deal stronger all around, but he wasn't in a rush to put it on. Right now, the best thing he could do would be to get some rest. "Mickey, how are the two of you doing?" he asked through the cord. The response came promptly. We've taken turns sleeping and keeping an eye out on the road. Every few hours, Elaine enters the town to check if the Holy Child has entered from a different side. As far as we can tell, they aren't here yet. Percy nodded, feeling a little better. Maybe they really had made a mistake. Of course, he wouldn't be able to relax completely for a few more days. Wake me up if anything happens, he sent back, before relaying the news to Nesha. The two then shut their eyes, their sheer exhaustion putting them to sleep mere moments later. It still wasn't clear whether the Holy Child was after them, but one thing was certain. Whatever ended up happening, Percy was ready for it. Chapter 246. Frantic Escape. Percy! They're here! Mickey yelled through the cord. Startled, Percy nearly messed up the rune he was carving on his scythe. It had already been a few hours since he and Nesha woke up, and he'd decided to take advantage of that to reforge his weapons too. Wait, you mean you can see them approaching? From the west side? He asked out loud, for Nesha's benefit. Mickey sent a mental nod back, causing him to raise an eyebrow. This was strange. While they'd split up on purpose, to determine whether the Holy Child was after him and Nesha or something else, he'd always thought the former was more likely. Evidently not, he muttered. Guessing what he was thinking, Nesha pitched in. Do you think he's chasing after Elaine? She's pretty and he's a teenage boy. Maybe she piqued his fancy? Percy couldn't help but wrinkle his nose at the sound of that. Doubt it. If he saw her, he would have made a move right then and there. No point in chasing her across Remir. Besides, how would he track her? Nesha shrugged. If he's not after us, and he's not after Elaine, that only leaves one possibility. Both their eyes widened simultaneously, realizing what this meant. Mickey, you need to get out of there right now, he yelled. Forgetting he was still in the inn, Nesha had to cover his mouth. Too late, the crow replied. He's running after me. Percy's heart skipped a beat. This was bad. Really bad. Usually, they didn't think twice about having Mickey act as a scout. Nobody would pay much attention to a bird flying several miles away, spying secretly from afar. Unless they were actively hunting him, of course. But he couldn't afford to panic. His familiar's life depended on him maintaining his composure. Biting his tongue, Percy forced himself to calm down, countless thoughts swirling within his mind. There had to be a way out of this. Listen to me very carefully, he said a moment later, this time keeping his voice down. Your priority is to put some distance from Elaine. Whatever happens, you can't let them see her with you. Understand? Between his two cores and acceleration, Mickey was a great deal faster than Elaine. He should be able to outrun the Holy Child, for a while at least. But the same couldn't be said about her. If she got spotted, she was done for. Understood. Where should I go? Percy rubbed the bridge of his nose, trying to come up with a viable plan. For now, I want you to circle around the town and lead them back to the same spot. Some confusion seeped through the cord, though Mickey didn't question his judgment, eventually sending a mental nod back. What's that going to accomplish? Nesha asked. It'll buy us time to intercept them. I just hope Elaine realizes she has to meet up with us here. Their greatest problem right now was that he had no way to get in touch with his cousin. Not without Mickey relaying their messages. Hopefully, she'd understand she wasn't supposed to follow Mickey after seeing him fly away from her. Either way, there was nothing Percy could do about that, other than to trust her. Not wasting a moment, he grabbed the largest piece of his armor from the pile, the chest guard, putting it on. Catching his drift, Nesha passed him the next piece, along with some reinforced string, helping him fasten it in place. Overall, the phantom scale raiment looked very different than it had against Rambert. Percy had learned a lot from their fight, modifying the spell extensively. To start, many pieces had been reshaped to give him greater freedom of movement. Some of the surfaces had been made flatter and wider to let him draw larger runes on them. He'd also moved the holes around a little to better accommodate the network of strings holding them together, so that his armor would be better at absorbing impacts. Furthermore, he'd added more vents throughout his body to account for the additional mana leaking out while he used the Troll's Fury potion. Help support creative writers by finding and reading their stories on the original site. Finally, there were the new runes. Other than the self-repair enchantment that had replaced all the preservation runes in the interior of the armor, he had added a lot to the exterior too. The innermost 2 layers were now engraved with both the hardness and absorption runes. As for the armor's shell, it now had hardness runes fused together with the concealment runes, making the whole thing far sturdier than ever before. Percy, I know you are at your strongest, but I still doubt we can beat a blue, Nesha said once they were done, her voice tinged with concern. Of course not, and we won't even try to do that. She tilted her head. At the end of the day, there's nothing we can do to stop the Holy Child. Our only option is to have Mickey lure him away and ditch him somewhere. But we can make things easier for him, at least. He elaborated. The guards. He nodded. Powerful as he is, he's just an impulsive kid. Now that he's caught sight of his target, I bet he'll rush ahead, leaving his guards behind. I don't think they can keep up with him. We'll wait for him to leave, before ambushing the others outside the town. If we can kill them all, it'll take some pressure off Mickey. That definitely sounds more manageable, but that's still 5 greens we're talking about. Are you sure we can beat them? She asked, unconvinced. We won't. Me and Elaine will, Percy replied, grabbing his scythes. He'd made 4 of them, though the last one was still missing a few concealment runes. It would have to do. Walking towards the door, he turned all his constructs invisible. He'd rather not draw any attention before leaving the town. I want to help, Nesha said, biting her lip. Sorry. He shook his head, closing the door behind him. He knew it was frustrating for her, but he couldn't let her join. She was very close to mastering circulation. She'd already started tempering her channels, but she wasn't there just yet. Nor did she have any of her traps at hand. As useful as her spell was, she wouldn't last a minute surrounded by so many powerful opponents. Not that Percy and Elaine had it much better, of course. Percy estimated he'd have to take 2 of the guards on, leaving the other 3 for his cousin. It wouldn't be an easy fight for either of them. Rushing out of the inn, he headed west, hoping to run into Elaine. Luckily, he did find her right as he neared the gate. That's one thing going according to plan, at least. He exhaled in relief. Percy! She exclaimed upon seeing him, running towards him. They're chasing Mike? She tried to whisper once she got closer, but he raised his hand to stop her. I know. How confident are you in taking 3 greens on by yourself? He asked. Suffice to say, attacking the divine root and a holy child's entourage no less was a grave crime. He and Nesha were too far gone already, but Elaine hadn't done anything too incriminating until now. Whatever happened, they couldn't leave any survivors behind. I'll do it, she replied, not a hint of hesitation in her voice. Percy nodded, gesturing at her to follow. As much as he hated himself for involving her, he knew he didn't stand a shadow of a chance without her help. Plus, she cared about Mickey as much as he did. He had no idea what that bastard wanted from his familiar, but they couldn't leave him alone. How close are you? He asked through the cord. At the same time, he scanned the scenery outside the gate, looking for a good spot to lay in wait. That hill might do. It was where Mickey and Elaine had camped over the past few days. I'll be there in 5 minutes. The kid is still behind me. Do you want me to try losing him? No. For now, I need you to stay in his sight. What about the others? Are they with him? They fell behind some time ago, probably a couple miles behind the kid. Maybe more. Try to lure him about 100 meters from the hill, but don't get too close. I want the greens to pass near there, but I don't want the kid to spot us in his mana sense. Bringing Elaine up to speed, the two then rushed to the ambush spot, his heart racing in his chest. Elaine, do you know of any good hunting spots in the vicinity? He asked. Taking the guards out was only half the plan. Mickey would have to lose the Holy Child too, or it would have all been for nothing. Unfortunately, the crow couldn't possibly outrun the boy without going all out, which meant he'd eat through his stamina in no time. Consequently, he'd need to consume a few yellow cores to recharge once he reached his destination. Then he'd have to find a river or some other body of water to hopefully erase his scent, before circling around and meeting with them. There is a small patch of desert a couple weeks southwest from here. I've hunted scorpions there before, she said, giving him some more detailed directions. Percy relayed her words to Mickey, explaining the plan. The only thing left is to execute it. Soon, Mickey informed him that he and the Holy Child were almost there. Percy moved in front of Elaine, to hopefully hide her mana signature with his armor's concealment runes. Both of them crouched to make themselves look smaller, holding their breaths. A second later, they saw the boy running in the distance at an insane speed, the ground cracking wherever he stepped. Luckily, he didn't as much as glance their way, too busy chasing after his prey. Only once he was gone did they start pumping mana into their channels, activating their boosting arts. So far, so good, Percy thought, catching sight of the greens rapidly approaching them. It was time to deal the Divine Root another slap. Chapter 247. Elaine versus Divine Root. Elaine swallowed hard as the greens approached. Common affinities or not, these people were from the Divine Root. Even with circulation, taking on 3 of them wouldn't be easy. Still, it wasn't herself she was worried about. Will he be all right? She stole a glance at her cousin. She knew he'd beaten greens before, but always one at a time and with ample preparations. Plus, she'd never seen it in person. The last time she watched Percy fight, he barely managed to stun a goblin. And, technically, his grade hadn't even changed since then. Could he really handle this? Besides the upcoming fight, his current condition also worried her a little. Percy had already downed the potion, an overwhelming surge of mana spilling out of his pores, shrouding his body in a swirling teal fog. Soon, it faded from her eyes like the rest of his constructs, only visible through mana sense. His skin was flushed red, blood bubbling from countless expanding cuts as his muscles swelled more than they were ever meant to. Yet, he seemed unfazed by the pain, probably used to putting himself through hell by now. His glowing eyes stayed locked on their opponents instead, like a predator observing his prey. His fingers tightened around the invisible scythes in his grasp. One of them rested propped against a boulder for now, the one not fully cloaked. He clearly wanted to keep the element of surprise as long as possible, though they both knew it wouldn't last beyond the first attack, if that. His armor was invisible too, though it wasn't hard for her to make its shape out, partly because she already knew about it, and partly due to the way it displaced the mist. It doesn't matter. He'll be fine as soon as he drinks a few healing potions. We just need to survive until then. There was no turning back now. Their opponents would notice their presence in mere moments, if they hadn't already, and Percy's potion wouldn't last long. She had to wrap her own fight up quickly, in case he needed backup. One of the incoming greens suddenly snapped his head in their direction, sensing something was off. As if on cue, Percy lunged from his hiding spot, hurling 2 scythes toward him before following up with a flurry of throwing stars. Elaine didn't wait to see the outcome. Her focus shifted to the leftmost trio. She shot forward, channeling mana to her feet and skidding across the grassy terrain. At the same time, she raised her palms and unleashed a barrage of small, azure projectiles at the startled mages. Both Pressure Blast and Slippery Step were crude spells, but she could feel they were close to an upgrade. She hadn't learned them at random either. The same fight that forced her to reveal circulation to her father had also exposed her biggest weaknesses: limited range and poor mobility. She had no intention of letting those shortcomings hold her back again. The greens dodged her attack, quickly regaining their composure. Their eyes flickered between her and Percy, weighing their options, as if considering whether to gang up on her cousin first. "Like hell I'll let you," she snarled, stepping between them and Percy, mana coiling around her fingers as she manifested a set of glowing whips. Undeterred, they unleashed a barrage of spells at her. A few large fireballs, some water arrows faster and more condensed than her own shots, and a wave of earth mana rippling towards her feet. She clicked her tongue. This was going to be rather annoying. shredding the projectiles into harmless motes. She slid away from the earth mana right as it pierced towards her in the shape of a spear. Despite avoiding all of their attacks, she couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at the sight, however. She'd seen Earth users use similar attacks before, but this was different. It was faster and smoother than she was used to. It didn't look like regular stone either. It glistened in a dark color, resembling obsidian. Unauthorized usage. This narrative is on Amazon without the author's consent. Report any sightings. A blessing. Not that strange, considering where her opponents had come from. Outwardly, Elaine didn't divert her gaze from the trio in front of her for a second. Still, she couldn't help but scan the area behind her with mana sense. Worried about Percy. He was fine. Not that he had it easy, his fight was just as tough as hers. But he wasn't at a clear disadvantage either. Okay, I guess I'll just have to trust him. She nodded. Without wasting another moment, she went on the offensive, rushing towards the Earth Mage. Water splashed wherever she stepped, mixed with torn blades of grass, and she kept picking up speed as she dashed in a straight line, determined to cut the enemy ranks short. The mages responded in kind, raining more spells at her. But she didn't pay them any heed, forming more whips in her hands, turning them thinner and longer. Whatever attack neared her, she sliced and diced, not giving her opponents the chance to touch even a single hair on her head. The only spells she had to be careful of were the ones coming from below. Not that it was impossible to uproot the earth mana before it caused harm, but it would cost a lot of mana. Even with her boosting art active, she knew she had to pace herself for her reserves to last. Like demonic fangs, the obsidian constructs bit upwards, Elaine weaving and bobbing as they forced her to vary her path. Still, she persisted, closing into the Earth Mage with every step. Realizing the danger he was in, he ran backwards, sending more and more spells to block her way with every passing second. His teammates pitched in too, spreading out in opposite directions, trying to pincer her in with their own spells. Elaine never stopped parrying them, but each impact put a drain on her core. Her mana was running out faster than she could breathe it in. Even worse, the Earth Mage kept his distance from her, doing an admirable job filling her path with obstacles. Nice try. Her lip curled upwards. After fighting for years in the war against House Tantalus, she wasn't the inexperienced girl she'd once been. Taking a sharp turn, she ignored the Earth Mage entirely, closing into the Fire Mage instead. Taken by surprise and without his buddies to help him, the guy panicked, stumbling backwards as she spun, activating the Kraken's Gambit. She didn't even care about the airborne projectiles anymore. All of them shattered into nothing by her spell. The sickening sound of torn flesh and shredded bones never came. However, blinking once, Elaine saw the figure in front of her fade away. The Fire Mage stood a few dozen meters further back, still hurling fireballs at her. She didn't care about the weak attacks too much, blocking them with her refined spell as she racked her brain to understand what had just happened. Illusion? Some kind of bloodline? This was bad. These people clearly had all sorts of trump cards up their sleeves. Even worse, her core was already halfway empty, thanks to her costly move just now. And that was just the start of her trouble. The Fire Mage and the Earth Mage fired more spells at her, but the Water Mage had turned towards Percy instead, shooting a flurry of water arrows at him. Her cousin had already put his own opponents on the back foot, but the sneak attack caught him by surprise. The pressurized blasts knocked him off his feet, violently slamming him into the ground as teal fragments splintered off his armor. The outer layer was half broken, even the one beneath it taking serious damage as the invisible spell regained its color. Gritting her teeth, she allowed her whips to disperse before pelting the man's location with a barrage of her own blasts, stopping him in his tracks. Still, the damage was done, as Percy rolled on the grass, struggling to dodge his own opponent's attacks. Damn you, Elaine. You had one job. As much as she wanted to berate herself further, she knew this wasn't the time, however. The trio had launched more spells at her, and she didn't even have her whips this time to block them. Instead, she dodged them as best as she could, trying to think of a way out. Closing into them isn't an option, she grimaced. She'd already tried that, but they clearly had way too many tricks to deal with her. At least, she didn't think she could kill them fast enough, and trying would only give them a chance to go after Percy again. Besides, the Kraken's gambit was way too expensive. She had to rely on her slippery step for defense and the pressure blast for offense. But could she really win this with just a couple of crude spells? Either way, it appeared she had no choice but to try. Chapter 248. Sniping. Forcing her racing heartbeat to calm down, she scanned the battlefield with mana sense, observing her opponents carefully. Whenever they attacked, she dodged with minimal movement, doing her best to conserve her mana. At the same time, she took one deep breath after another, slowly refilling her core. How does he make his own spells so much faster than mine? She wondered, thinking back to the water mage's arrows. The only silver lining about this messy battle was that she had a perfect example in front of her, to help her improve her magic. And it didn't take her very long to come up with a hypothesis. It has to be the air resistance, at least to an extent. By shaping his attacks into arrows, he could propel them through the air much faster than hers. Still, that couldn't be everything. A huge factor was the caster's ability to compress the water, as well as the force they shot it with. And she really had no excuse for losing in that department. Not with circulation filling her body with strength. As soon as she recovered some more of her mana, Elaine began her counterattack, aiming at the water mage. He was the only one who hadn't shown a blessing nor a bloodline just yet. He might have one anyway, but for now he seemed to be the easiest target. That said, she didn't allow herself to lose sight of the others, constantly tracking their movements via mana sense. Sidestepping all the hostile attacks, she focused on him as she reshaped her projectiles into arrows no different than his. It didn't take long for her to see an improvement either. Her arrows could still use a lot of work, but they were already a little faster than before. The water mage noticed that too, raising an eyebrow as he realized she was copying him. Still, the distance separating them gave him plenty of time to dodge. Let's see how much longer you can keep the upper hand. She smirked. Taking full advantage of her boosting art, she compressed each of her arrows even further before loosing it. Not only that, but she put more power behind them too, making each more lethal than the last. Over the next few minutes, her constructs changed shape again, now resembling crossbow bolts more than they did arrows, letting out a shrill cry as they pierced through the air. How do you like that? I bet you can't push yours this far. Before long, the water mage couldn't even fight back, too busy dodging her attacks by the skin of his teeth. Still, his teammates didn't let him suffer much, pressuring Elaine into slowing down her onslaught. At least they did so at first. At some point, the fire mage turned towards Percy again, aiming a fireball at him, thinking she hadn't noticed. Not this time, she spat, intercepting the spell midair, before shifting her focus to him. The guy appeared genuinely taken aback as an aquamarine bolt pierced through his chest. But she didn't let herself celebrate, knowing it wouldn't be this easy. Sure enough, the fire mage faded again, appearing a few meters away unharmed. He can hide himself, but not his spells. If he could, he would have already hit Percy with it. She realized it was a good thing to know, and her own spell was developing nicely too, though a new problem had presented itself. The obsidian spears weren't that difficult to dodge individually, but the earth mage had already filled the battlefield with them, blocking her line of sight. That much wasn't an issue by itself, as she could still spot everyone through mana sense. Still, it was harder to get a clean shot at her opponents, and her mobility was starting to be impacted too. In theory, it wouldn't be difficult to clear out her surroundings using her whips, but that was probably what the bastard wanted. To get her to empty her core again. Unauthorized use. This story is on Amazon without permission from the author. Report any sightings. Elaine clicked her tongue, but she wasn't deterred. Annoying as they were, they made for excellent whetstones to hone her magic. And she was improving rapidly, now that she had a perfect case study to observe. Of course, she didn't know how long it had been, nor how her cousin was doing. Perhaps his potion was about to run out. Or maybe it already had. But she couldn't afford to lift her attention from her opponents again. In any case, she had yet to be stabbed in the back, so the worst-case scenario probably hadn't come to pass. She'd been way too arrogant to think she could kill 3 members of the Divine Root quickly and still have the strength to assist Percy. Not only that, but she should have shown more trust towards her cousin. At the very least, he'd handled his end of the fight just fine. He certainly wasn't the one who'd messed up. Turning back towards the water mage, she fired another bolt at him, this time trying to pierce through an obsidian construct. The water mana did drill a hole through it, but it had slowed down greatly by the time it emerged out of the other side, splashing harmlessly on the next obstacle it encountered. "This is such a foreign fighting style to me," she grimaced. While she developed her new spells to eliminate her weaknesses, she never thought she'd be relying on them exclusively. Certainly not in such a difficult fight. Her whips, she'd honed her whole life, first through her father's tutelage and then through years of combat. The Kraken's Gambit was the spell she was proudest of, her specialization, her expertise. But she quickly shook her head, realizing how stupid these thoughts were. "I'm acting like a spoiled brat. No wonder I'm in my 20s with only 2 refined spells." Did Percy ever complain over having to learn something new? When he suddenly had to master an entirely new affinity all of a sudden? Or when he found himself with a familiar he had to take care of? Or when he had to pick alchemy up and learn to brew his own elixirs, because there was simply no other way for him to advance? Or when he bargained with a titan to master runecrafting, because it would be a waste not to? Or every time he ripped his soul up, to use his bloodline or circulation or get his spectral trait? Of course not. He never complained. He was grateful for all these opportunities, always making the most of them, because he knew he didn't have the luxury of letting them slip by. And he excelled in everything in the end, not through talent but sheer effort. Meanwhile, what did Elaine do? She turned him down when he offered to teach her runecrafting. She stuck with what she was comfortable with, drank the elixirs he brewed for her, and she still had the gall to look down on him. Gritting her teeth, she pointed her palm against her opponent again. A spear punched up at her. She sidestepped it. 3 fireballs were coming her way. She ignored those. Sadly for their caster, the earth constructs inhibited him as much as they did her. Instead, she focused on the water mage and him alone. A blob of water gathered in her hand. She compressed it into a marble. But she didn't stop, pressing it more and more, as it vibrated, threatening to explode right then and there, shredding her own hand into minced meat. Another black pillar was about to emerge beneath her feet. This time, she merely flung her free arm, using a rough whip to dig the earth mana out before it coalesced. Her focus was still on her opponent, who was watching her carefully, unsure what she was up to. She let go. Unlike before, she didn't fire many bolts. That would only be a waste of mana. And focus. No, she only needed one. A good one. One fast enough that he couldn't dodge it. One sharp enough to pierce through everything in its path. An azure flash shone through the battlefield, the cool light reflecting off the smooth pillars. It was accompanied by a deafening boom, rattling them. As Elaine felt her very bones shake, a wave of pain spreading up her arm. But her gaze never wavered. It followed her attack through the hole in the construct, and the one behind it, and the one behind that, all the way to the hole in the guy's torso, a lake of blood soaking his robes as he collapsed. "Congratulations! Your spell has evolved. Pressure blast, crude dash, demersal sniping refined." Elaine didn't care much about the notification right now. Part of her wanted to look away from the carnage. But she was no longer a kid, nor was this a war she'd been thrust into out of her control. No, her involvement was the result of her own choices. Averting her gaze would be hypocritical of her. She scanned the corpse, taking the gruesome sight in for a few seconds. Only then did she allow her senses to brush over the battlefield, settling on the other 2. Their expressions were still marred by shock, their attacks having long stopped. They weren't stupid. They could tell it was over. Sure, the The spell had eaten quite a chunk of her mana, and her hands still hurt like a bitch. But she could keep going, and the others knew that they were screwed without their teammate. Slaughtering them both wouldn't take more than a minute. Chapter 249, Regalia. A few minutes earlier, the green twisted his body into the space between the two scythes, narrowly evading the spinning blades. Still, the last-second maneuver left him in an awkward orientation, forcing him to eat several throwing stars right to his soul. He landed on the grass with a muted thud, spasming in pain. As much as Percy wanted to follow up with a finisher, the guy's teammate had already launched a few wind blades at him, each cutting shrilly through the air. Percy barely managed to avoid most of them, though one still hooked around his leg, making a crisp ting against his armor. The good news was that the reinforced construct held, the hardness runes ensuring the attack left little more than a shallow scratch on the leg guard. A scratch that was already closing as the self-repair enchantment devoured part of the shroud. Wow, I guess the two spells complement each other nicely. He hadn't really planned for this. The shroud enveloped his body out of necessity, as the mana gushed out of his pores faster than he could use it. It tightly wrapped around his armor like a strip of cloth, since that was simply the best way to keep it from dissipating until he shaped it into an attack. Luckily, the runes seemed to benefit from the abundance of mana in the meantime. Overall, it did give his armor an almost regal appearance. Percy currently looked like a magical knight cloaked in an eerie fog. Or, well, he would have if his mana was visible. That said, the force on his leg still tripped him, bringing him down to one knee. By then, the first mage had stood up again, supporting his teammate with some wind crescents of his own. So, they both have an air affinity, Percy realized, rolling out of the way. It wasn't the best possible matchup for him. Their high mobility would make landing his spells a pain. Not the worst either, though. At least, their attacks didn't pack as much of a punch as fire or lightning magic might. Getting through his armor wouldn't be that easy for them either. Percy ignored the crescents, not even glancing at them as they dug deep grooves through the soil where he previously stood. Instead, he hurled his third scythe at the first opponent. The guy struggled to conceal his pained expression, still suffering from soul damage. At the same time, Percy called the other pair of scythes back, trying to catch him from behind. More attacks flew towards Percy in the meantime, though their shadows preceded them. His eyes had already adjusted to his enemy's common affinity. The fact that they fought in the same manner didn't work in their favor either. Sure enough, Percy didn't have much trouble evading the attacks, though his target wasn't as lucky. It was a good start. I just need to keep pressuring the injured one. Letting the grim dance run rampant, Percy allowed the shadows of his opponent's attacks to blend with his own, taking control of the battle's flow. He showered the first guy with a rain of scythes, knives, and throwing stars, instantly putting him on the back foot. That said, inflicting more wounds didn't prove nearly as easy. The guy did an admirable job propelling himself out of the attack's paths with some expertly placed bursts of wind. Still, Percy did land a few here and there, the man's injuries noticeably gnawing at his reaction speed. Of course, several air spells hit Percy too. He couldn't dodge them all. Fortunately, he didn't need to, his armor allowing him to shrug most of the damage off, his shroud helping him undo the rest. Suffice to say, he was still in a lot of pain, though that was mostly self-inflicted. It was his own potion breaking his body down from within. It tore his tendons apart with every step he took, nearly ripping his arms out of their sockets every time he swung them. Yet, he gritted his teeth, knowing he needed the boost to win, and that it wouldn't last for much longer. At least, they're weaker than Jason. Percy was keenly aware of how lucky he was. Not that he was afraid of losing a rematch against the Karma user. Certainly not now that he had his armor. But he doubted he could handle two opponents at that level. Fortunately, it appeared that not all the Roots Greens were nearly as strong. He was about to redouble his attacks on the injured guy when something unexpected happened. A powerful blast splashed into him from the side, slamming him into the ground a few meters away. His armor cracked. The spell clearly had a lot more concentrated force behind it than what his own opponents had demonstrated. You could be reading stolen content. Head to Royal Road for the genuine story. And this was just the start. A second projectile followed, and then a third. Teal fragments flew off him as his armor's outer layer got peeled off, his bones creaking in protest. Ignoring the pain, Percy gathered the teal fog in front of him to serve as a cushion. It barely helped, sapping some strength from the blasts, though they still pierced through the soft mana without much difficulty. He focused on the network of threads holding his armor together, trying to keep the reinforced strings from snapping. The whole spell would come undone should that happen. The self-repair enchantments all over his body greedily drank his mana, doing what they could to restore the construct. Still, the runes couldn't fix themselves, so any component damaged beyond a certain threshold was lost for good. This was one of the few drawbacks of his armor's modularity. An issue he couldn't solve quite yet. Either way, he gritted his teeth, absorbing the attacks as best as he could, trying to minimize the damage. His only option was to trust his cousin to stop the assailant, and she had to do it fast. Unfortunately, it wasn't until after the fifth blow that the barrage came to a halt, and the damage was already done. His opponents didn't waste their chance, taking advantage of the interference to pile more spells onto him. Even worse, he wasn't sure he could endure them all given the current state of his armor. Percy clumsily evaded whatever he could, grimacing as the rest caused the cracks to expand. The self-repair runes fought like crazy to restore whatever was still salvageable, though teal shards kept falling rapidly as the spell crumbled faster than he could mend it. I need to cut their momentum short, he realized, pulling two of his scythes from behind the first mage. Of course, the man wouldn't fall for this trick again. That said, the distraction did cause the barrage to slow a little, giving Percy a chance to extricate himself. Admittedly, things weren't going very well. Percy's body was as banged up as his armor at this point, if not more. Still, he could win this as long as his cousin didn't let her opponents sneak up on him again. Come on, Elaine. I'm counting on you. Shifting his focus back to his enemies, he thought hard as to how he could turn this around. The first of them was already injured rather severely, but it would take Percy a while to kill him. The potion wouldn't last that long. Percy estimated he only had a couple minutes at best. The situation was rather bleak, though a spark of hope lit up in his eyes as he glanced at the crater he'd formed on the ground during the attack. That could work. Oblivious to his thoughts, his opponents never stopped pressuring him, launching one spell at him after another. Percy allowed himself to fall in their tempo, slowly backtracking as they advanced towards him. Just a little farther. It wasn't until half a minute later that everything was in place. If this didn't work, he'd die not long after, and Elaine would soon follow. Here goes nothing. Dodging a wave of attacks, he hurled both of his scythes at the injured mage, pulling the last two from behind him. At the same time, he tore off over 80% of his shroud, turning it into a wave of throwing stars to supplement his main weapons. His opponent didn't panic, however. Despite being surrounded by spells in every direction, he was already moving to avoid the constructs, well accustomed to the routine by now. Sadly for him, Percy had forced him to step right where he wanted him, and he'd planned a small surprise there. With a wave of his hand, Percy called some more mana back to him. This time it wasn't his scythes, nor the throwing stars, however. He was looking at the crater behind the air mage, the very crater that he'd dug into just minutes ago. Or, more specifically, the invisible shards of his broken armor that lay there. Just like that, a wave of shrapnel sank into the man's back, a shocked expression painting his face. The shards might have not been as sharp as the throwing stars, but they were made of reinforced mana, packing quite a punch. And dozens of fragments landed into the guy's soul, leaving it full of holes. Percy knew this was more than enough to kill him, so he didn't even bother looking at him for a second longer, his focus already shifting to the remaining opponent. Grabbing the pair of scythes that had just returned to him, he took advantage of the second guy's surprise as he hurled them towards him, following up with more projectiles from his shroud. To his credit, the man recovered quickly enough to dodge most of them, though Percy had anticipated it to an extent, having spread the throwing stars as widely as possible. A few found their mark, stabbing into the guy's lower body. His knees buckled as he finally got to experience the agonizing soul pain his late comrade had suffered repeatedly.
TSCH.
Not enough. Percy clicked his tongue. He was already out of spare scythes and out of mana. Even worse, his opponent would regain his wits within moments. If he failed to finish him now, he might never get a second chance. Thinking on his feet, he willed the remaining layers of his armor to shatter, grabbing as many shards as his hands could hold, before hurling them at the mage. The guy tried to leap out of the way, but he failed to summon enough strength in his legs. He barely managed to sway to the side, several shards still finding their mark, lodging themselves in his torso. Unsure whether this was enough, Percy called upon the rest of the fragments he'd just shed off his spell, drawing them to his hands. A few actually stabbed into his flesh, but he didn't care. He launched them at his opponent too, pinning him into the ground with another wave. And he didn't stop there either, doing it a third time and a fourth. By the time he saw his opponent's soul fizz away into nothing, blood was pouring out of Percy's hands, even more so than the rest of his body. But it didn't matter. It was done. Congratulations. Your spells have merged. Shroud of Deceit. Refined plus Phantom Scale Raiment. Refined - Spectral Art. Phantom Scale Regalia. Masterful. Chapter 250. Masterful. Normally, Percy would have just ignored the notification. It wasn't the first spell he'd upgraded, nor would it be the last. Plus, he had plenty of things on his plate right now. Whether it was the potion's backlash, Elaine's fight, or his familiar getting chased by a blue, everything took precedence. Still, his heart skipped a beat upon reading the spell's tier. Masterful? Just like that. Suffice to say, he hadn't expected to reach that level at this time. He'd long accepted that his first masterful spell would register once he figured out the mana threads his spectral trait had commissioned. A project that might not be completed until years from now. Then again, it wasn't that strange his new spell qualified. Both his armor and his shroud had already evolved multiple times while remaining in the refined Tier 3 in total. That ought to have brought them both on the verge of an upgrade, and that was without considering the most recent round of improvements to the Phantom Scale Raiment. And, in hindsight, the emergent spell involved way too many moving parts, too many requirements, to have stayed refined. It made use of crystallization, reinforcement, his spectral trait, affinity fusion, rune crafting, and magiscript. Hell, he needed 2 cores, synchronization, and a specialized potion just to produce enough mana to keep it active. Not to mention how well the 2 spells synergized with one another. The shroud acted as both a 4th layer for his armor, but also as the perfect fuel for its enchantments. Beyond that, his latest trick of discarding the raiment and turning its fragments into projectiles was quite similar to how he normally used the shroud in the first place. Yeah, on second thought, I suppose it makes sense. In the end, he allowed himself a momentary grin before shifting his attention to his other problems. By now, the potion's effect had already expired, a wave of weakness spreading over his shredded body. Plopping down on the grass, he struggled to lift his arms. They felt heavy, as if they'd just turned to stone. Even grabbing the healing potions in his pockets was a monumental task, as was uncorking them and chugging them down. It wasn't until a few seconds later that the life mana did its job, finally pushing back against his exhaustion a little, closing his wounds just enough to minimize his blood loss. Yet, it took a total of 8 doses before he could move around normally. Only then did he allow his gaze to brush over the rest of the battlefield. She seems to be doing all right. He exhaled in relief. Truth be told, Elaine appeared to be at a disadvantage. This was partly because she was relying solely on her crude spells to keep her opponents at bay, and partly because her surroundings were littered with obsidian pillars inhibiting her mobility and line of sight. Still, this perceived weakness was just an illusion. The only reason she was on the back foot was because she was being careful not to let her enemies sneak past her again. Had she been allowed to fight freely, she would have probably won by now. Her opponents clearly know what they're doing though, Percy acknowledged. They could tell they were outmatched, but they were experienced enough to take advantage of their numbers and of the other battle happening in parallel to their own. Like that, they prevented Elaine from focusing on any one of them for too long, allowing them to keep her busy. Still, they've already lost. Originally, they had aimed to buy time for their comrades to kill him and come to their aid. By now, they'd already noticed this wasn't going to happen. At least, Percy didn't miss the despair marring their expressions. Unauthorized tail usage. If you spot this story on Amazon, report the violation. Calling the scythes back to his hands, he reactivated his boosting art, preparing to intervene should his cousin need any help, or should her opponents try anything funny. He was much weaker without the armor, of course, and he'd rather not drink another dose of the potion so soon if he could avoid it. Still, he was confident in keeping one of the greens busy for a while if he had to. Let's not intervene until she needs me to. Percy wasn't in a hurry to butt in. As worried as he was about Mickey, he knew there was nothing more they could do to help him, besides maybe sending him some mana. On the other hand, he could tell his cousin was on the cusp of a breakthrough. She was obviously working on upgrading her spell, her water arrows growing sharper and faster with every second. As tough as her fight was, it was also a precious opportunity he didn't want to rob her of. Over the next several minutes, he carefully observed her battle, while sending all his excess mana to Mickey. From what the crow said, the Holy Child was still hot on his tail, but the bird was able to keep him at a safe distance. Adding in the teal mana keeping his stamina up, and he shouldn't have much trouble reaching his destination in time. Soon, a change occurred in the battlefield, drawing Percy's attention. Elaine focused a lot of mana in her palm, compressing it to a small marble at first, and then a glowing azure dot, before unleashing it towards the other water mage with a deafening boom. A bright flash filled the scene as a shockwave rippled outwards, all the way to Percy's feet. Still, his eyes were glued on the devastation his cousin had just unleashed. Several obsidian spears had been pierced cleanly, in a straight line to the man's chest. The poor guy's blood was already pooling on the ground, his eyes glazed over. Moments later, the other two ran away, sprinting in different directions. A waste of time. Elaine shouldn't have much trouble killing the first one and catching up to the second by herself. Still, to avoid any accidents, Percy hurled his scythes in front of the fire mage, blocking his path as his cousin went after the other one. The guy shot a few fireballs at him in a panic, though it wasn't very difficult for him to avoid them. Percy kept him occupied for a few more seconds from a safe distance, buying time for his cousin to deal with the other one before coming over. Do you have any idea what you've done? Ambushing the divine root, a holy child's entourage. You'll be hunted to the ends of Remir for this? The guy said, resorting to threats upon realizing he couldn't escape. Percy sighed. A little late to worry about that. The guy raised an eyebrow at first, seemingly puzzled by his response. It wasn't until a moment later that his pupils dilated, the realization dawning on him. It's you, isn't it? The ghost alchemist. The one on the posters. Percy shrugged, but he didn't deny it. They had to kill this guy either way. Huh. Then you're even more screwed than I thought. The man chuckled. You might think it's not a big deal since you're already fugitives, but people will come to investigate what happened. You've just brought more trouble to yourselves. Why would you even do such a thing? I didn't have a choice. Your boss is currently chasing after my friend, Percy said. The man frowned. The crow? It did seem a little too smart for a lone beast. Still, is it worth messing with a holy child for a bird? Let me flip the question. Percy replied. Is it worth for everyone to lose their shit over that brat? To spoil him rotten? To let him do whatever he wants, harm whomever he wants, with no consequences? How long have you even traveled with him? I bet he hasn't treated you guys very nicely either. The mage didn't reply immediately, seemingly pondering Percy's words. What choice do we even have? Our world can only exist as long as people like him are there to hold the sky up. Does it even matter how they treat us? We'd all be dead without them. Not just me, but my family too. Same goes for you and those you love. It is what it is. Percy remained silent. He didn't really have a good response for that. As much as he hated it, he knew the man wasn't wrong. He could try spouting some grandstanding nonsense all day long about not wanting to be protected by scum like that holy child, but it would be nothing more than hollow bullshit. The truth was that everyone did depend on the divine order. For all their flaws, Remir was better off for them. The only thing he could do was to further his resolve in changing the status quo one day. Not saying anything else, he hurled his scythe at the fire mage. The guy didn't even resist, knowing he couldn't escape. Soon, the weapon cleanly bisected his soul, as the fifth and final member of the Divine Roots squad dropped dead. Percy glanced around. The place was a complete mess. They had to clean everything up before anybody saw it. Assuming that hadn't happened already. His expression fell as his eyes landed on some teal fragments littering the grass some distance away. So much for never having to reforge my armor again. Chapter 251. Reaching the desert. Mickey felt his hunger return with a vengeance. Rapidly consuming his stamina, he kept both instances of his boosting art active at all times. Most prominent was a set of glowing amber lines branching out of his heart, reaching every corner of his body. A second set spread from his abdomen, swirling like green gales of wind, lighting his feathers up. I wish I'd finished tempering the new channels. Had he done that, he could have relied more on his second core, lifting some pressure off his beast mana. Alas, the Holy Child had found him a few weeks too soon. As things stood, Mickey had to expel the excess water mana from his body, leaving an azure trail in his wake. Glancing back, Mickey saw the boy was still chasing after him, showing no signs of giving up. Bastard or not, he had to admit the kid was persistent. That said, he'd no intention of falling into the Greenborn's clutches. Just as he contemplated whether it was worth accelerating, a sudden influx of teal mana flooded his body. We've got everything under control here. How's it going on your end? Percy asked. He's right behind me. Should I try losing him ahead of time? I'm not sure I can make it to the desert like this. But Percy metaphorically shook his head. All the more reason to pace yourself. Don't burn through your stamina any faster than this. Use my mana to slow down the exhaustion. Mickey did as he was told, knowing his friend was right. As uneasy as he felt flying in the boy's sight, he understood his priority was to reach his next meal, otherwise he was screwed. Even if he managed to escape from the Holy Child, he'd starve long before anybody could help him. Gathering the fused mana to his beak and talons, he took advantage of the raging flow of beast mana in his bloodstream to feed his first core. Of course, it still wasn't enough to offset his expenditure. Percy's 2 orange cores falling a little short of his yellow one. Not to mention that his conversion efficiency had yet to surpass 25%. Still, that should buy him a little more time. A few more days passed, Mickey's condition continuing to deteriorate. His body was already shriveled and weak, many of his feathers falling off or losing their luster. If his rampant hunger wasn't enough, sleep deprivation was also starting to gnaw at him. Though it wasn't all bad. Percy was still pumping teal mana through the cord, taking very few breaks if any. He was doing an even better job supporting him than when they were in the Camelot province, probably realizing he needed every last mote to survive. Even better, the Holy Child had actually fallen behind. Not because of anything Mickey had done. He was still flying no faster than before. Rather, it was the boy himself that had stopped at some point, probably not used to exerting himself for days on end. Should I take a break too? Mickey wondered, though he shook his head the very next moment. Tempting as it was, it wouldn't help with his starvation. He was better off reaching the desert sooner rather than later. Plus, it might be easier to ditch the kid if he didn't waste the head start. Having made his mind up, Mickey pressed on, determined to get through this. It wasn't until the following day that the grassland gave way to a sandy terrain. The shift was gradual at first, but Mickey was surrounded by tall dunes soon enough. The ground beneath him looked like a light brown sheet stretching as far as his vision did, its folds and creases glistening under the scorching sunlight. Mickey ignored all that, not in the mood for sightseeing. Instead, he scanned the scenery in search of his targets. It didn't take him long to spot a few scorpions, though they were all at orange. The yellow variants were supposedly farther in, according to the information Elaine had shared. You might be reading a pirated copy. Look for the official release to support the author. If I don't find them in the next hour, I'll eat a few of the smaller ones to build my strength up, he decided. Swooping down for a quick snack wouldn't take more than a couple of minutes, but he'd rather not waste a second more than necessary. After all, he had no idea how close his pursuer was. Luckily, he ran into the first of the human-sized variants soon enough. It was actually in the middle of cannibalizing one of its smaller brethren. Not that strange, given the relative scarcity of food in the area. Mickey understood well enough the pressure beasts his grade were under on a daily basis. Strong prey probably didn't pass through here often, so the scorpions had to eat each other regularly to survive. It meant the survivors were the strongest among their kin. Still, Mickey descended at a ridiculous speed, pumping all his air mana into his feathers. Rending Tornado took effect as he spun through the last stretch. The scorpion tried to stab at him, but its stinger shattered harmlessly against his beak, as its venom got scattered by the violent gusts of wind. The creature didn't even suffer much, Mickey drilling through its tough carapace with ease, as if it was made of paper. Strong or not, there was no yellow beast on Remir half as powerful as him, and he wasn't in the mood to play around with his food right now. Searching through the scorpion's remains, Mickey swallowed its core whole before pecking the other pieces in a rush. Whether it was the hard shards of chitin from the beast's exoskeleton, or the soft chunks of meat contained within, it all tasted heavenly to the starving bird. His only regret was that he couldn't slow down to savor it. In fact, he even kept circulation up with his second core, to replenish the air mana he'd just consumed by the time he finished his lunch. It's done. I've managed to grab a bite. The kid is nowhere to be seen. What now? A wave of relief gushed through the cord. Suffice to say, Percy had been worried sick about him over the past week. Eat another if you've got the time. As many as you need to fully charge up. Then, head northwest, but don't use circulation with your first core if you can avoid it. We don't know how long it'll be until your next proper meal. Mickey nodded. You said there should be a small lake there? He asked. Yes, right where the sand ends. Elaine says it should be hard to miss. You need to wash yourself there, before changing course to the northeast. Hopefully that should be enough to cut the trail short. All right. Technically, they still didn't know how the Holy Child was tracking him. The most likely culprit was a bloodline, though they had no idea how it worked. That said, escaping from the boy's sight and erasing his scent ought to be enough. If not, there wasn't much else he could do. Where are we meeting? Mickey asked again. We're heading to the Thirsty Valley. We couldn't stay in Goldenfield Town after killing those greens. I think we've done a decent job covering up the mess, but we figured it was better to distance ourselves from that. Just follow the cord to me whenever you can, Percy said, though he failed to mask the worry in his tone. Mickey knew his friend didn't like him traveling alone. Even though he'd proven strong and fast enough to take care of himself, Percy was a bit overprotective. It could be annoying at times, though Mickey still felt some warmth in his chest, happy to have somebody looking out for him. Don't worry about me. I'll catch up before you get there. The next few hours went by quite smoothly. Mickey ate 2 more yellow scorpions until he felt as stuffed as he'd been after Jason and Rambert. Making his way to the lake, he bathed there for a couple of minutes before taking off towards the others. The Holy Child was nowhere to be seen. Mickey flew slower than before, conserving his beast mana while relying exclusively on his second core to boost his speed. Percy never stopped providing him with mana, which helped a lot more now that he wasn't eating through his stamina in a rush. I guess it's over, Mickey exhaled in relief. Still, he didn't relax until well past nightfall, to ensure he put some more distance from the lake, so that the kid didn't stumble into him by accident. Only when he was certain he was safe did he allow himself to land at a relatively concealed spot behind a hill, to finally get some proper rest. Tomorrow, I should look for another body of water. Maybe vary the route I take a bit too, just in case. Sleeping alone in the wilderness without anybody to watch over him was inherently risky, of course, but he didn't have a choice. He'd have to do it sooner or later, and it was already long overdue. In any case, Mickey had done everything he could to eliminate the danger. The rest would be up to his luck. A rumbling sound woke him up, as the very ground beneath him shook. Jumping to his talons, he saw tall walls of stone erect all around him. He tried to fly away, but he was a moment too late, as a ceiling of the same material formed above him, blotting out the sky. Everything instantly went dark, save for a rectangular hole allowing some light to enter from one side. It was as tall as a person. A doorway. Mickey tried to waddle over to the only exit, though a figure soon stepped in front of him, blocking his path. He was shorter than Percy or Nesha. Kid. Mickey struggled to make out the features of the dark silhouette, though there was no question in his mind as to his captor's identity. Any lingering doubts evaporated soon enough, as he saw the blue core thrumming in the boy's chest, a suffocating domain sapping his will to resist. Mickey could do nothing but watch, as the figure grinned, an ominous glint forming in his eyes. Chapter 252. Bow your head. The domain sapped the strength from his muscles, as Mickey felt the stone walls closing in on him. It was over. The only way out was through the Holy Child. Suffice to say, taking on a blue just wasn't realistic. In fact, Mickey found it difficult to even move an inch right now. How? Just how did he find me? He'd truly thought he'd lost him. He was sure he'd done everything right, yet the kid had still caught up, somehow. You look confused. The boy's grin widened. I admit, washing away your scent was a smart move, as was pacing yourself and varying your path. Did you come up with that by yourself? Or is there someone helping you? Mickey just stared at him, pretending he couldn't understand him. The boy clicked his tongue, seemingly disappointed by his lack of a reaction. Well, it doesn't matter. Unfortunately for you, I had you in my sight for way too long. By now, there's very little you can do to mask your trail from me. I can sense even the slightest trace of your mana, the faintest ruffle of your feathers. Your fate was sealed days ago. Hearing that, Mickey felt crushed. Outwardly, he didn't show it, however, doing his best to keep a stoic expression. Out of options, he reached out to the only person who could help him. Percy, I've been caught. He sent through the cord. A jolt of shock and horror soon reached him, followed by stunned silence. But it didn't last more than a couple of seconds before shifting to cold determination. I don't know what he wants from you, but I doubt he went through all this trouble just to kill you, Percy said. This means we've still got a chance. For now, you need to figure out his intentions and keep me updated. Oblivious to their discussion, the Holy Child raised his hand, an eerie red glow radiating from his palm. Instantly, Mickey felt a suffocating grasp intruding in his body. It was even worse than the domain, violating his very essence, exerting dominion over his soul. In some ways, it resembled the connection he shared with Percy. It was intangible, ethereal, closer to an idea than a physical object. But in other ways, the two couldn't be further apart. Whereas his bond with Percy was one of equals, this one was the exact opposite. A cold chain grinding painfully against his mind, robbing him of his freedom. The glow faded, the Holy Child slowly lowering his hand. Bow your head, he commanded. How ridiculous was that? How vain. But Mickey found himself unable to resist. The moment the words reached his ears, his body acted against his will, his gaze lowering in submission. He fought back, of course, but the only thing he achieved was to hurt his neck. At least, he doesn't have access to my thoughts. He noticed. It was his only solace. The chain the kid had inflicted on him seemed to lack many of the ethereal cord's features. He doubted they could share mana either. Apparently, the boy had to voice his orders for the bloodline to take effect. Still, the situation was grim, to say the least. His mind was trapped in a body that refused to obey him, like a puppet subject to the Holy Child's whims. Confirming he had achieved his vile objective, the boy exhaled in relief. If you stumble upon this tale on Amazon, it's taken without the author's consent. Report it. You know, I wasn't sure this would even work on you. I've never met a yellow beast as smart as you. Can you even be considered that, actually? Having 2 cores and everything? Mickey didn't reply. One advantage he had was that the boy didn't know he could speak, and he'd rather keep it that way. If he found out, he might order him to spill all of Percy's secrets. As things stood, he doubted he'd be able to resist. "Hey, don't look so gloomy," the boy spoke again. "You should be honored to serve me. I'll reach godhood one day, and you might just be able to follow me." Then he scratched his head. "Well, I think so. The truth is, nobody with my bloodline has made it that far before. No beast has reached godhood either. At least not on Remir. But hey, there's a first for everything." Waving his hand, the boy caused the construct to shatter, a cloud of dust filling the area. That, too, settled forcefully on the ground, forming multiple mounds of dirt and sand all around them. The boy ignored all that, already walking away. He was heading a few degrees east of Percy's group. Mickey guessed he was probably planning to return to Goldenfield Town first. "Come on, we have to pick those idiots up. They're annoying, but I need them. Preparing my own food is a pain," he said, gesturing at him to follow. Mickey waddled along, physically incapable of doing otherwise. "I'm actin', by the way." The tension in the air was palpable as the trio walked along the dirt path. The chirping crickets and the bright rays of the morning sun did little to improve everyone's mood, as they all scrambled to think of a solution. Naturally, Percy had already relayed Mickey's predicament to his companions. "Should we return to the town? We still have a few days until they get there. We can try ambushing the kid too," Elaine suggested. Percy shook his head. "I don't feel confident against a blue ambush or not. Do you?" Elaine's head drooped, but she didn't give up. "We can't just leave Mickey behind though. Who knows what that brat will do to him?" "Of course not," Percy muttered before sighing. "We know where the kid is headed. As soon as he fails to find his underlings, he'll either wait for the root to assign him a new group, or, most likely, he'll just go to the Thirsty Valley on his own. Do you understand what that means?" Nesha drew a sharp breath, being the first to realize the implications. "We need to get there first," she exclaimed. Percy nodded. "Currently, the only way to grow strong enough to beat the Holy Child is to advance. Still might not be enough, mind you. Our gap will shrink, but his domain is still going to be a problem. That said, this is our only hope to free Mickey." As things stood, everyone in Percy's group was closer to their next promotion than the kid. Not only were they a decade older than him, they'd also used a lot of Aurora Dew in the past. And they'd continue to do so as soon as they got some more ingredients. They were a week closer to the Thirsty Valley too, as Mickey had lured the boy quite far over the past few days. Unfortunately, all their advantages were fleeting. The boy traveled faster than them, and he wouldn't have to sneak into the Thirsty Valley either. He could just introduce himself and enter directly, probably saving a lot of time there as well. Elaine gasped as she realized what he meant. "If he gets to Violet first, it's over." Percy nodded. Should that happen, they'd never catch up. Even with Aurora Dew, their next promotion would be over a century away. Needless to say, that was way too long, even inside the Thirsty Valley. Not to mention all the elixir they would need to get there. Currently, all their supplies had come from House Tantalus. Percy had no intention of taking down another 10 houses anytime soon. "Mickey, do everything you can to delay him. The more time you buy for us, the better," he transmitted, getting a mental nod back. "It's not so bad, everything considered," Nesha said, trying to lift the mood. "How so?" Elaine asked. "Well, think about it. The kid will keep Mickey fed, at least. Nobody will dare touch either of them, nor ask any inconvenient questions. In some ways, it's easier for Mickey to travel this way. We won't have to worry about him starving or getting discovered." Percy shook his head, however. "That's the part that worries me the most." The others gave him a questioning look, prompting him to elaborate. "Sure, the kid can easily locate and kill beasts for Mickey to eat if he wants. But would he bother to go through all that trouble?" Elaine tilted her head. "What's the alternative? He can't just let him starve, after everything he did to capture him."
"No.
"He can't," Percy said. "But there's an easier way to feed him. Elaine's eyes widened in shock as she realized what he meant. He wouldn't. The color drained from Percy's fist, some blood dripping from his knuckles as his nails dug into his palm. Let's hope not. Chapter 253. Return to Hue Hue? A couple of weeks ago, the group was still en route to the next town when Percy's second experimental clone returned. In the end, he hadn't found anything of interest in the alien horse's world, which was a bit of a bummer. That said, Percy and his clone had managed to keep the cord in its empowered state throughout the journey, indicating that the upgraded secret art indeed held the potential to revolutionize his adventures. After he practiced with it some more, of course. In any case, his soul injuries had already healed thanks to synchronization, so the group had paused for a while to give him the chance to send another one out. However, he wanted to try something a little more interesting than merely testing out the soul resonance spell this time. Are you confident you can return to Hue Hue? Mickey asked, some emotion seeping into his voice. Percy shrugged. I wouldn't say I'm confident, no, but I think there's a chance. One of the biggest issues with his bloodline had always been the lack of navigation. For years, Percy had only been able to send his clones in random directions, hoping they stumbled upon something of value. And sure, it had worked to an extent, though he was constantly on the lookout for ways to plan his adventures better. Currently, his only option was to use Metatron's decree to return to the vault at will. There was also a possibility that he could somehow return to the mysterious girl. At least, he vaguely remembered promising to do so, though he couldn't recall how exactly it was supposed to work, nor had he heard from her since. At any rate, his latest spell did potentially open a new door for him. Here goes nothing. Severing the orb thrumming in front of his stomach, he watched it shoot away into the distance like a teal comet. I guess I won the coin toss this time. The clone thought, suppressing a chuckle. Whenever he activated his bloodline, it was a 50-50 chance that determined which side of the cord he ended up on. Of course, whether he was truly better off than the main body would be decided during the next few days, depending on how enjoyable this trip turned out to be. Soon, a packet of soul mana slammed into him. Instinctively, he bounced it right back. Not that difficult, since he was already too saturated to contain any more mana. Plus, they'd already been doing this sort of thing for the past week. 2 weeks, in fact, from my perspective. An interesting thing he'd discovered was that it helped for the main body to initiate the communication. That lessened the risk of the clone focusing on Remir too hard and returning prematurely. Sometime later, the packet arrived once more, the clone repeating his earlier action. It took a few more round trips for the connection to widen. Even so, they'd have to keep sending their thoughts and mana through it periodically to prevent it from closing. Are you ready for the next test? The clone asked. Obviously, Percy hadn't the slightest clue where Hue Hue was, but he did have somebody with him who might. Well, kinda. The idea was simple. Whenever Percy left Remir, there was always a powerful pull trying to drag him back. A huge part of it was due to his connection to his physical body and the rest of his soul, but he knew that couldn't be everything. After all, when Mickey died, Percy had struggled to pry him out of Hue Hue. At first, it hadn't made sense, as there hadn't been any trace of Mickey's soul left to anchor him there, and his body had already turned into a corpse by then. The only logical explanation was that souls had an innate connection to their world of origin itself, outside of Percy's shenanigans. And it was precisely this connection that he was hoping to harness right now. Stolen from its rightful place, this narrative is not meant to be on Amazon. Report any sightings. We're ready. The main body replied. I've already empowered my bond to Mickey too. He's currently trying to locate Hue Hue. Their plan made sense on paper, though there were a few potential complications. To start, only a fraction of Mickey's soul was actually from there. Even then, it had been nearly a decade since he started over on Remir. If there really was any lingering connection to the gladiator's home, it had to be extremely faint, considering that the crow had never even noticed it in the past. Then again, he didn't even know about Hue Hue until a few days ago. He might find it. Now that he's actively looking for it, the clone waited patiently for news. Admittedly, it was quite annoying, as he was literally floating in the middle of nowhere, with nothing to do. Hell, he didn't even have any thumbs to twiddle. That said, he didn't envy his main body much. The poor guy had 2 cords to maintain. And all of that while still walking towards the next town. Okay. The original transmitted at some point, breaking him out of his thoughts. Okay. The clone was startled. You mean he actually found it? If he could really return there, it would be great news for everyone. Now that Mickey had started recalling his past, a trip to Huehue might help jog his memories. But there was so much more to it than that. Of all the places Percy had visited, Huehue was among those he wanted to return to the most. The reason? The final step of the dance, of course. Other than his second core, Percy's boosting art was arguably his greatest trump card. And if merely half of the spell had had such a huge impact on his life, he could hardly fathom what he could achieve with the rest. Well, we aren't sure. The main body admitted. He thinks he can sense something, but it's several times weaker than the other connection. Still, it's worth a try. Just follow my instructions. The clone acquiesced, listening carefully, though they both knew it was still a long shot. Even if Mickey's unknown connection truly pointed towards Huehue, there was no guarantee the clone would make it. For starters, he wasn't even directly linked to the crow, so the main body had to act as the intermediary between the clone and the familiar, coordinating the whole process. Even if the clone followed the instructions perfectly, he understood the way space and time got distorted inside the soul plane wouldn't help. Worst case scenario, I'll just go to a random place. It isn't much different to what I would have normally done. It took some back and forth, but the clone eventually turned his gaze towards a certain direction, almost certain that was where Mickey said he felt Huehue. Letting his senses expand, he soon spotted countless souls in the region. Scanning them carefully, he looked for a suitable target to possess. Sadly, he didn't find one at first. There were a couple injured souls tugging at his attention by the corner of his vision, but he didn't allow himself to even glance at them. It had taken him ages to narrow down Huehue's suspected direction. The last thing he needed was to get himself pulled elsewhere. We've got a bit of a problem. Assuming I'm facing the correct patch of space, I can't find anything to possess. He transmitted back. Keep looking. It's an entire world. Somebody ought to get injured sooner or later. Besides, we aren't in a hurry. The clone nodded internally. His priority right now was to do his best to reach Huehue. If he returned empty-handed, so be it. It wasn't like the attempt had cost them much. More time passed. If the clone was guessing, he'd say it had been around 5 hours since his creation. Still, he didn't need to guess anything, as he could just ask the original. According to him, it had been closer to 10 hours on Remir. Geez, no wonder some of my clones take ages to return. Who knows how much time I've even wasted in this place without realizing. Regardless, a couple of souls did get injured as he waited, though Percy hesitated to make a move. One of them was a blue. He had no idea if he'd even be able to possess them. He was tempted, of course. Whether or not they were on Huehue, he wouldn't mind a chance to play around with a domain. But the guy died a little too fast for his liking. The others did too. It wasn't until a few dead people later that he finally settled on one that was promising. Dying slowly. Yellow core. Probably sapient. I think we've got one. Can you and Mickey verify that I'm still looking at the right place? He asked. Conscious of the soul plane's distorted nature, he was aware his senses might have drifted off during the past few hours. It took a while longer for his support team to help him confirm that his target was still in the acceptable region. All right, make sure to cross your fingers, 'cause I ain't got any, he said, allowing his mind to sink into the damaged soul, a powerful force pulling him towards it. Soon, his connection to Remir shrank back to its regular width, the distance probably too much for soul resonance to hold this time. But it didn't matter. Now that he'd locked onto a host, he no longer needed it. Huehue or not, his path was set in stone. Patching the soul up went smoothly. There was no rejection from his host, nor did he seem to need anybody's permission. Weird. The only other time this happened was with Takeo. Is this person gone too? Either way, he wasn't one to look a gift horse in the mouth. Tapping into the body's senses, He opened his eyes. Glancing down at his body, and then at his surroundings, one thing immediately became clear. Whatever this place was, it wasn't Huehue. Chapter 254. Leo. Stitching the fragmented soul up, Percy was a little worried. The shards felt dull and inactive. His hosts were absent. Save for a few scattered memories he figured he could tap into if he really needed them. At first, he thought this person had taken more damage than expected, though it soon became apparent that wasn't the case. The pieces of his soul weren't really in that bad a shape. A good thing too, since Percy wasn't sure he could fix a yellow soul with his limited stash of mana if it was too far gone. I suppose it's just the guy's mind that's been wiped clean, for some reason. Coming to his senses, Percy found himself on a bed. A rather soft one at that. The mattress smelled of all sorts of aromatic herbs, probably an indication that it had been washed recently. He had a ton of questions already, though he shoved them all aside for now, examining his body. Only 2 arms. No beak either, he frowned. I guess I was too optimistic, hoping to reach Huehue on the first attempt. Technically, it was still possible this was Huehue, even if his host wasn't one of Mickey's people. However, that ship sailed for good once he spotted the 2 yellow suns shining outside the window. Oh well, I'll just keep doing this with all my future clones until I get lucky. He shrugged. Either way, he wasn't too disappointed. He'd known it was a long shot from the start, but it didn't mean the trip was a waste. Far from it. His host was sapient and at a decent grade. The body was in good shape too. At least, Percy failed to find any serious injuries after a quick examination. He still had no idea what had killed the poor guy, but it hadn't left any physical marks as far as he could tell. The place itself seemed quite promising too. He wasn't underwater, nor underground. He hadn't died in the wilderness either, nor in some deadly challenge or a damp cell. Just a regular bedroom. No, better than regular. It's actually nice. It was larger than even Elaine's room on Remier, full of fancy furniture and enchanted appliances, each adorned with all sorts of intricate runes. Not quite on the vaults level, nor at the Morais, but more advanced than anywhere else he'd been to. Getting up, he winced in pain, the shift having shaken his brain a touch. He hadn't even noticed the headache until just now, used to experiencing such things. This was the first sign of damage other than his host's curious absence. On closer inspection, he was drenched in sweat, as were his clothes and his bedsheets. Did this guy die from an illness or something? Shrugging, he walked up to a mirror, scrutinizing his appearance. He was dressed in silken robes no less dazzling than what the Divine Root wore, though the style was a little different. A vertical line of buttons adorned his chest, his collar jutting upwards in a funny manner. Slightly over the top for Percy's taste, but the locals' fashion was the last thing on his mind right now. His host was a bipedal humanoid, closely resembling a human. His proportions were off, being a little shorter than he'd expect. Maybe he was just a kid? Either way, the boy was way hairier than a teenager should be, or even a grown man for that matter. His skin was covered in what he could only describe as fur, a light brown color. Same shade as his hair, though that was longer, flaring outwards like a lion's mane, splashing down on his shoulders. His ears were large and pointy, barely sticking out. He had some facial hair too, though it was quite strange. A bunch of long hairs scarcely adorned the space between his nose and upper lip. Not really a mustache, more like whiskers? His golden eyes were split down the middle by sharp, vertical pupils. For long canines jutted out of the boy's mouth too, giving him an almost feral appearance. As for his digits, they ended in sharp fingernails, curving a little like claws. Oh well, who cares? Let's see what I'm really dealing with here. Turning his senses inwards, Percy stirred the mana in his sternum a little, cracking a smile as he recognized the familiar affinity. Not the best, but not far off either. He'd used it enough to feel comfortable with it. Ensure your favorite authors get the support they deserve. Read this novel on Royal Road. There was something else too, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. This clone felt different than all the others, somehow. Not that there was anything wrong per se, just something out of place. But he couldn't tell exactly what it was. Perhaps his status would hold the answer. Undersir. Leo Percival's clone. Mana cores. Mana core 1, yellow or air. Mana core 2, seed. Spectral trait. Weaving boosts one's proclivity in manipulating one-dimensional structures. Spells. A secret art. Soul resonance, refined. Spectral art. Soul stitching, refined. A soul harvester, refined. Reinforcement, refined. A spirit-forged effigy, refined. A spectral art. Phantom scale regalia, masterful. Alchemic principles. A extraction. Separate and condense an ingredient's essence. A pacification. Delay an ingredient's activation rate. Redirection. Adjust an ingredient's effect. A deattunement. Prevent multiple conflicting ingredients from reacting with one another. Bonding. Enrich an ingredient with crystallized pure mana. Decrees. Phoebe's decree grants access to your status. Morai's decree, incomplete, grants the seed of a second mana core. Requires potent life mana to germinate. Metatron's decree, open a one-way portal to the vault of magic at will. EA's decree, modified, augments and enhances your status. Undersir. Nope, nothing there. Well, whatever it was, he'd figure it out at some point. What concerned him more was the situation here. There didn't seem to be any global decree in place, but a civilization this advanced ought to have at least something worthwhile. Over the next few minutes, Percy took his sweet time searching around the room, looking for anything of interest. Though he did take lots of small breaks too, to fiddle around with the appliances. Neither the heater nor the night lamps were anything special, but he wanted to examine their enchantments, to see if they were any good. A little better than what we have back home, but still trash compared to mine. Overall, the boy had lots of useless possessions for him to sift through. Clothes, shoes, and even sealed satchels filled with snacks. Not that strange, in hindsight. This was just a teenager's room after all, not a king's treasury. But he did find a few things of note, gathering them into a pile on his host's desk. Most of them were books, or well, on closer inspection, the majority were notebooks filled with scribbles. He'd check them out later if he got a chance. The good news was that there seemed to be enough of Leo's mind left to let him understand the language. This one's a diary. An excellent development. Whether this was Leo's home or some other facility, people would seek the boy out sooner or later. Going through the kid's diary was a priority. Coupled with the lingering memories, it might teach Percy enough about his host to avoid exposing himself. Placing the diary on the top of the stack, his gaze shifted to the other two noteworthy objects he'd found. Both were medium-sized jars made of glass. They were sealed, but opening them was as simple as twisting the lids. Still, Percy couldn't help but furrow his brow as he looked at their contents. Both jars were filled with pills, each containing a different type. The first, a vibrant amber color, the other a deep red. He could already harbor a guess as to the mana types involved, but he was still grateful for the rather informative labels confirming his suspicions. Core cleansing pills. Sleeping pills. No huge surprises there. Though the labels did contain some additional information, mostly warnings and recommended dosage. The amber ones were supposed to be consumed once every 2 days, lest one caused permanent damage to their core. Pretty much on par with the elixirs they had on Remir. Percy fully intended to consume one later, as soon as he figured out how long a day was in this place. Though he wasn't in a rush. The boy's core still burned a little, so it couldn't have been long since his last dose. Not that he expected to advance in any reasonable time frame, but there might be some insight to be gained from the local brews. Next, Percy's eyes landed on the other jar, this time some surprise finding its way into his expression. For the short-term relief of insomnia. Recommended use. Take no more than a single pill every 2 days. Warning. Exceeding the recommended dosage can result in serious mental damage. Wow, this is some potent stuff the kid was on. He frowned. He wouldn't be certain until he dove into the diary, but it appeared he'd just found the culprit behind the boy's untimely demise. Anyway, he'd better get on that before somebody came looking. Grabbing the notebook from the stack, he plopped down on the bed, flipping through the first couple of pages for some answers. There was a lot he wanted to understand, both about his host and this world, but one thing took precedence. He needed to know what this place was. Luckily, it didn't take him long to stumble upon the answer. Proud Heart Academy. Chapter 255. Academy. Somebody knocked. Percy lazily stood up, making his way to the door. Internally, he was a lot more anxious than he showed, of course. His heart raced at 100 miles an hour, as did his mind. But he forced himself to walk as casually as he could, trying to appear normal. Well, this lock ain't helping. He frowned, taking a little longer than he'd like to figure out how he was meant to unlatch the mechanism. If his visitor found the delay strange, he didn't show it. It was another boy, slightly taller than Leo. His hair was a couple shades darker too. Hey man, just thought I'd check up on you, since you missed today's affinities class. Everything all right? Luckily, Percy had just about read enough of the diary to get a handle on his host's life. His scattered memories also helped put a name to the face. This guy was Klatz, one of Leo's closest friends. I'm fine. I felt a little off earlier, but I'm better. The other boy creased his brow, seemingly unconvinced. You sure? You're not still taking those pills, are you? He asked, trying to peer into the room. Percy stood on his tiptoes to block the guy's sight. Not that he cared if the pills got discovered. From what he'd learned, their use was perfectly legal. Besides, it wasn't like he had any intention of taking them. But he knew his host would have acted defensively under these circumstances. That's none of your business, he snapped. I said I'm fine. Klatz sighed. Look, I'm just worried about you. You've been missing more and more classes lately. Those things can be dangerous. Percy relaxed a little, not wanting to come off as too confrontational. Leo was technically on good terms with this guy. It was a fine line he was currently treading, trying to protect his privacy without alienating one of his closest friends in the process. Part of him felt guilty lying to the kid about his dead friend. But he figured it wouldn't change much if Leo overdosed a few weeks later than he was meant to. At any rate, the opportunities here were too precious to waste. I appreciate the concern, but I can take care of myself. Thanks for dropping by, he said, softly closing the door. Hopefully that was the correct blend of politeness and rudeness. Truthfully, he knew he'd have to minimize his contact with others. They were unlikely to suspect their buddy was possessed by an alien ghost just because of an awkward interaction or two. But he'd rather not take any more risks than necessary. Besides, there was nothing for either party to gain by keeping the charade up. Returning to his bed, he opened the diary again, picking up right where he'd left off. An academy, huh? I always wanted to attend one. The concept itself wasn't foreign to Percy, though such institutions weren't exactly common on Remir. Nobody cared about educating commoners, and each noble house typically took care of their own children, teaching them the language and a few basics before leaving them to themselves. Even House Avalon, which was larger than the average noble house, didn't have enough kids to justify any type of formal schooling. Anyone who wanted to study more could just dig into the family's library, much like Percy himself had done. The only exceptions to the rule were the great houses, as they had enough people to warrant organized teaching. The most notable example was House Etna, which had built a kind of rune-crafting academy for their convenience. Over 90% of their students came from House Etna itself, though they often offered a few spots to some of the other great houses, usually as bargaining chips in various deals. From what Percy had heard, the Alchemists Guild had also considered building an academy in the settlement. More than once, in fact. But the talks never led anywhere, mostly because Remir already had enough elixirs for all the people who mattered. Either way, Percy could study all sorts of things during his time here. The only issue is, I can't stay forever. His main body was still possibly on the run, so any benefits he obtained might need to be delivered in a timely manner. Even if that hadn't been the case, Percy always tried to manage his time efficiently. I guess I'll need to focus on the most valuable things. This content has been unlawfully taken from Royal Road. Report any instances of this story if found elsewhere. Returning to his host's desk, his eyes landed on a small piece of parchment. A memo, scrutinizing it carefully. Rising Day, Precasting 3. Sword Day, Geography 7. Falling Day, Affinities 5. Resting Day, no classes. Percy scratched his head, trying to make sense of the timetable. From what he could tell, days on Felmara passed about twice as fast as they did on Remir. It actually hadn't been that long since he arrived here, but it was already dark outside. Suffice to say, the natives couldn't get nearly as much done in a day. Students only had enough time to attend a single class for a few hours each morning. They then had the afternoon to themselves for studying, followed by a short nap at night. Their weeks consisted of only 4 days, which the natives could tell apart based on the orientation of Felmara's twin suns in the sky. Due to the way the world rotated, this changed with every passing day. If the suns lined up vertically, it was a sword day, whereas if they lined up horizontally, it was considered a resting day. The two diagonal orientations in between were the rising day and falling day, accordingly. As for the Academy's courses, they were designed to last a term each, about 15 weeks, or a month in Remir's time. Every student picked 3 topics to focus on during each term. Percy still had no idea how long each student was allowed to stay in the Academy, or what the requirements were for graduating. It doesn't matter. It's not like I can spend longer than a term or 2. Luckily, the current term was due to end in a couple of days. There would be 1 week without lessons before the next one began. While Percy was interested in all sorts of topics, he knew he had to carefully pick the subjects he wanted to concentrate on during the coming term. Grabbing a thin booklet from the stack, he blew the dust off before reading its title. Proud Heart Academy Curriculum. From its state, Percy knew it had been ages since Leo had last needed to consult the booklet. It didn't take students long to familiarize themselves with what the Academy offered, and to choose whatever subjects they were interested in. But Percy would have to read this more carefully before making his mind up. Let's see. No way I'm keeping geography. I can also safely rule out history, natural resources, fauna, flora, local dialects, cultural studies, and politics. Music, painting, calligraphy, and everything else under arts is out too. Same for psychology and biology. Heck, these things might not even apply to humans. Not that he wasn't a little curious about this place, but none of these things would matter to him much once he was gone. Well, natural resources might hold something interesting, but he didn't think he'd be able to get his hands on anything particularly precious in the limited time that he had. And even if he somehow did, he'd have no way to bring it back home. I can consider dropping affinities too, if I run out of slots. It's just a broad overview of various mana types and the ways in which they're commonly used. It wouldn't be the worst topic to study. He might learn about a rare affinity he'd never encountered before or get some ideas about his own magic. Still, this stuff wasn't unique to Felmara. Spending his limited time on it sounded like a waste. There were plenty of courses diving deeper into specific affinities too. Each of the common ones had a bunch. Sadly, this wasn't the case for rare or composite affinities. The Academy probably didn't have enough students interested in those at any given time to justify employing teachers to run those classes. Besides, Leo had an air affinity. He wouldn't be able to explain a sudden interest in a different one. It's a pity. I guess I'll have to seek out that girl if I really want to develop my soul magic further. In any case, there were still a bunch of topics he was interested in. The only thing that annoyed him was that he'd only have the time for a couple courses in each subject, at most. Well, Cosmic Studies is a standalone class anyway. He realized, according to the booklet, they'd teach him about the universe and the various factions operating in it. Hopefully more than what Remir's gods were willing to share with the populace back home. Granted, he might be able to learn this stuff in the vault too, but it would cost an arm and a leg. I'll take it, and I'm keeping precasting too. He decided. As far as he could tell, precasting was a rather useful technique which everyone could master, regardless of their affinity. It didn't sound like the most groundbreaking invention, but it was something unique to Felmara, which instantly bumped its priority by several spots in Percy's mind. The only issue was that his host was already taking the third part of the course, and Percy couldn't remember anything about the previous ones. Maybe I can figure it out from Leo's notes. If he's the type of guy to write a diary, there's a good chance he documented his studies. If that wasn't enough, he could try the library. At any rate, he had a whole month to figure out the fundamentals. Afterwards, he could slowly develop the rest back home. So, do I pick runecrafting or alchemy for the final slot? Both held the potential of teaching him something new, but he figured any runes he learned here would be a downgrade from the vaults. Not to mention that they simply wouldn't be compatible with his own, and he'd have to learn a brand new language. That said, he didn't think that the local branch of alchemy was much better than what he knew either, but he figured the odds of gaining some valuable insight in this field were slightly higher. But Leo never took alchemy before, and I don't know if the first part of the course is the most suitable for me. Tomorrow's resting day. I should hit the library before finalizing my choices. Having come up with a preliminary plan, Percy turned the lights off, trying to get some rest. He knew he didn't have long before the suns rose again. He was fairly happy with the subjects he'd picked, and there was something else to look forward to. There was another course that was handled a little differently than the rest. It was mandatory for all the students of the academy, and it was gradually taught throughout their stay, not during a single term. Percy hadn't found many details about this in either the diary or his host's memories, but it certainly sounded like something he should look into. Mana flow, huh? I wonder what that's all about. Chapter 256. Library. Percy's eyes snapped open as the first rays of sunlight streamed into the room. He was still exhausted, but he forced himself to sit up, knowing that if he didn't, he might end up sleeping through the entire day. Stretching, he made his way to the window, curious to take in more of Felmara. He hadn't had a chance to appreciate the scenery yesterday, too busy catching up on Leo's life. Wow, this is quite the view. Leo's room was situated high up, likely on the 4th or 5th floor, and faced outward. Before him stretched a sprawling garden, reaching all the way to the horizon. It was meticulously maintained, with grass that had an unusual bluish tint. Colorful flowers were arranged in intricate geometric patterns, each centered around a tree. Cobblestone paths wove through the garden in a loose grid, with a few benches scattered throughout. Most remained empty, as only a handful of people were up this early. Pity I don't have time for sightseeing, Percy lamented. Leaving the room, he headed down the corridor to a restroom at the corner. Fortunately, Leo's remaining memories had firmly ingrained its location in his mind, likely due to the boy's frequent visits. Truth be told, he didn't urgently need to go, but he preferred to handle it before the other students woke up. The fewer people he ran into, the better. Figuring out how the facilities worked took a few minutes longer than he would have liked, but he managed to return to his room before anyone else emerged. He tossed on a fresh set of robes and gathered a few notebooks he thought he might need later, placing them in a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. He shoved a few of the sealed snacks in there too. He'd no idea what they tasted like, but he'd need to eat sooner or later. Then he set off for the library. By now, a few students were already up and about. Fortunately, most only greeted him in passing, while some ignored him altogether. He did get more than a couple odd looks from both groups, though. Had Leo done something to offend his peers, or was it simply too early for socializing? Either way, it worked in his favor. As he walked, he began to realize the academy was even larger than he'd initially thought. The dormitories alone spanned multiple buildings, each towering at least 6 stories high, and every student had their own room. I've got to hand it to them. These people really invest in education. Percy still didn't know much about this world, but everything he'd seen so far left a good impression. A high standard of living, relatively advanced technology, and a well-structured educational system. Running some numbers in his head, he estimated that the academy housed over 1,000 students. That meant it either belonged to a powerful faction, or that Felmara was a relatively peaceful world, allowing multiple smaller factions to send their children here without worrying about their safety. Maybe the lack of a bloodline decree plays a role in that. By now, Percy had noticed the pattern. Worlds with bloodlines, like Remier or the Vault, tended to be far harsher on their mortals. It made a twisted kind of sense, eliminating the weak freed-up space and resources, accelerating the mutation of new and stronger bloodlines. Of course, every place had its own share of problems, and he was sure Felmara wasn't an exception. Still, compared to everywhere else he'd been, it seemed to be on the better end of the spectrum. Well, so far, at least. Finding the library proved a little harder than expected. Unlike the restroom, its location wasn't as firmly embedded in Leo's mind. I should have looked through his stuff for a map of the academy. Making a mental note to do that later, he decided to ask somebody for directions for now. The only issue was that Leo wasn't a freshman at this place. Percy had already seen plenty of kids younger than him. Not knowing where to find something as basic as this was bound to raise an eyebrow. If you spot this narrative on Amazon, know that it has been stolen. Report the violation. Better ask one of the older students then. It would still sound odd, but he figured they were less likely to know him personally, and thus less likely to make a big deal out of it. Looking around, he ignored all the people his age, walking up to a girl half a head taller than him. She had short, blue hair. A bit of a trend that he'd noticed actually. The girls here all had shorter hair than the guys. He wasn't sure if it was physiological or cultural. "Excuse me, which way's the library again?" The girl instinctively wrinkled her nose as her eyes lit up in recognition. Weird. It seemed the older students knew him too. And they didn't seem to have a good impression of him either. Just what kind of jerk had he possessed? To her credit, she masked her irritation not long after, however, creasing her brow as her thoughts shifted to his question. Sure enough, it was a dumb thing to ask. Seeing her reaction, Percy was already scrambling to come up with a good excuse. "Stuck with a crappy teacher?" she asked back. "Huh?" He tilted his head. This was not the question he was expecting. "What does that have to do with anything?" She shrugged. "Well, why else would you need to go to the library? Just go to your classes. It's easier to learn that way." Percy was too stunned to speak. Why would he go there? He could list a dozen reasons off the top of his head. Brushing up on stuff he'd forgotten, building up the foundation to pick a new subject, studying a topic he didn't have a slot for. Do these kids want everything to be spoon-fed to them? He was a little offended. She seemed to have no idea how precious of an opportunity this academy was. Then again, he couldn't help but recall how few people ever bothered using the libraries on Remier. Perhaps laziness and complacency were universal traits. No wonder Metatron had to threaten his people with starvation to get them to study. Oblivious to his scathing critique, the girl spoke again, probably in a rush to brush him off. "Anyway, it's been years since the last time I went there. I think it's somewhere that way, a few corridors down, close to the cafeteria. Or wait, was it the auditorium?" Suppressing the urge to lecture her, Percy thanked her before following her admittedly dubious instructions. She hadn't given him much, but it was still better than wandering blindly. He did ask another kid later, hoping to get some better directions. But no, the response was more or less the same. These so-called students took the academy for granted. In the end, he did reach the place after having to backtrack once or twice. His irritation all but evaporated as soon as his eyes landed upon the countless towering bookcases, each dozens of meters tall. Geez, this place is several times larger than the one in the guild. At least the library wasn't completely empty. It seemed the academy did have a few hardworking students. But he ignored them for now, making his way to the clerk. "May I help you with something?" the man asked. He was the first adult Percy had seen, and he was quite old too. His mane was a dull gray color, his face sporting more than a couple of wrinkles. A yellow core pulsed in his chest. A Redborn, Percy guessed. Not bad. Landing what looked like a somewhat relaxing job in a prestigious academy seemed like a good deal, given the guy's birth grade. Outwardly, he smiled before replying. "I'm thinking of changing courses next term. Is there any kind of overview of the available subjects? Something a little more detailed than the booklet?" he asked, holding the curriculum up. The clerk fiddled with his whiskers for a couple of seconds. "What courses are you leaning towards?" I was thinking alchemy, precasting, and cosmic studies. Though I'd like to see what's in runecrafting and affinities too. Also, maybe a reminder on what to expect from mana flow, just so that I can better prepare for future lessons. The man struggled to stand up, his knees making all sorts of creaking sounds. He had to be really old to be in this bad a shape at Yellow. Probably in his 400s. Percy hurried to his side, helping him up. "Sir, just point me to the right shelves. I'll find the books on my own," he offered. The man didn't stand on ceremony, nodding before guiding him to the requested resources. A couple were higher up on the bookcases, so Percy had to use some of the sliding ladders attached to them to get to the books. He was tempted to use his air magic to pull the books out, but he knew he'd make a mess in the process. And he respected this place way too much to risk it. Took a while, but he eventually found what he needed. Walking to a free table at a corner of the room, he set the books in front of him before taking a seat. Next, he picked the first one from the stack, flipping to the first page. He knew he didn't have much time. Days on Felmara were already short to begin with, and he'd wasted a lot of time getting here. Let's see what the local alchemists can do. Chapter 257, Restructuring. It wasn't until most other students had left the library that Percy registered how late it was. Getting used to Felmara's short days would take a while. Normally, his body's internal clock would have helped a little, but his host was the kind of guy who'd literally overdosed on sleeping pills, so no luck there. "I'm not even halfway done with the books," he groaned. He still wanted to research his choices a little better before submitting them. Sure, he had 2 more weeks until the next term started, but he also had lectures to attend. Sighing, he closed the book he was reading, getting up. Whatever the case, he couldn't miss the precasting class tomorrow. It would help him make his mind up. Though I can probably skip geography the day after. Technically, the academy did monitor attendance. Apparently, each academic year consisted of 7 terms, a total of 21 courses of the students' choosing. The kids were assessed at the end of the year, selecting 18 of those courses to sit exams for. And they only needed a passing grade on 15 of them to move up to the next year. A student's seniority simply denoted the number of subjects they had studied. That said, most courses weren't locked to specific years. For example, one was free to pick Affinities 1 on their 1st or 5th year if they wanted. Of course, courses with a lot of prerequisites would often be picked later out of necessity. Admittedly, it was a rather generous and flexible system, but missing too many classes incurred a penalty on one's grades, making their life harder. Still, Percy wasn't very concerned about that. The 2nd term hadn't even ended yet, and he intended to be gone before the 5th at the latest, depending on how fruitful his time here proved to be. "Excuse me, sir. Can I borrow these for a couple of days?" he asked the clerk. "Up to 3 at a time," the man replied, passing him a checkout slip to fill in. Percy nodded, storing the ones he had yet to read in his satchel before returning the rest to their shelves. Then he waved the clerk farewell as he left. The corridors were much emptier than they'd been in the morning, most of the students having gone to bed to prepare for tomorrow's classes. Finding his way back took some head-scratching, thanks to the contrived path he'd taken to the library in the first place. But he didn't care much. He had a few more things to take care of before calling it a day. Grabbing one of the food bags from his satchel, he opened it, tossing the first of the orange flakes into his mouth as he leisurely strolled through the dormitories. "This stuff tastes awesome," he blurted out as the exotic snack crumbled between his teeth with a satisfying crunch. It was really crispy, salty too, though it left some lingering sweetness in his mouth as soon as he swallowed it. They were called Crimbian leaves, according to the label, but he wasn't sure if they'd come from an actual tree. Either way, this journey was turning better and better by the hour. Returning to his room took him around 15 minutes in total, more than twice what it should have taken. In that time, he finished 3 packs. He was tempted to open another one, but he figured he should probably ration them a little until he figured out how to get more food. Luckily, he made it to the correct door on the first try, saving himself from a potentially awkward situation. Dropping off his stuff on his desk, he then stopped by the restroom for a quick shower, his mind still pondering over the things he'd read earlier. As he had expected, alchemy on Falmara wasn't that different to what they had back home. Their core-cleansing pills were made from the goo of some caterpillar-like beasts. Having consumed one earlier, he realized it wasn't any more potent than the elixirs he was used to. Pity. Their other products were a little more varied than the potions they had on Remier, however. Part of that was due to having a greater variety of useful ingredients, but another part was due to something else. The locals referred to it as alchemical restructuring, and he was confident it was the kind of thing that his status would register as an alchemic principle once mastered. Ensure your favorite authors get the support they deserve. Read this novel on the original website. It's definitely worth looking into. Apparently, the natives brewed their products in all sorts of different states. Potions, pills, soluble tablets, gels, lotions, and even inhalables. Suffice to say, this had initially struck him as odd, as he hadn't encountered this elsewhere. Alchemy on Remier had been developed entirely around the purification of nectar into elixirs, and so everything they crafted usually took liquid form, largely thanks to the underlying techniques used. Meanwhile, alchemy was a lot more developed on Atlantis than either Remier or Falmara, but the fact that it was underwater placed a lot of restrictions on what was possible. People there had to condense their brews into dense, waterproof pills, so as to store and handle them without worrying that they would disperse. Evidently, Falmara's alchemists had gone down a different route, learning how to customize their brews into a phase tailored for their intended application. And it was easy to see the benefits of doing so. Some products could be more effective when applied directly to one's skin, whereas others might be best delivered into one's lungs or stomach. Percy already had an idea as to how this could benefit him. The mushrooms his potions were extracted from worked better when injected directly into one's body. Unfortunately, he'd been forced to use the potions somewhat suboptimally, as he had no intention of planting mushrooms inside his skin, and no idea how to brew them into something other than drinkable potions. But this new principle could potentially open a new door for him. Plus, there are other advantages to learning this. The Divine Order was currently on the lookout for the Aurora Dew. Specifically, the old version of the Aurora Dew vials containing a turquoise liquid. But Percy had brewed the most recent batches using his teal powder instead, because he'd stashed a lot of it for his constructs. Using the fused mana instead of regular pure mana didn't change the effects of the elixir in any way, but it did change its color slightly, giving it a silver tint. If I can reshape it into pill form, it'll be completely unrecognizable. Not to mention that it'll probably take less space in the amulets. These two applications aside, he wouldn't say no to mastering a new alchemic principle. Even on a purely theoretical level, it would deepen his understanding of the field and help him boost his yield a little faster. Not to mention that his eyes would benefit from it too, possibly allowing him to see things he might otherwise miss. The only problem is that it's taught in Alchemy 9 through 12. He grimaced. Naturally, one couldn't learn alchemy without getting their hands dirty. Consequently, the relevant courses were split into theoretical and practical, typically alternating between the two for any given topic. Alchemy 1, 3, 5, and 7 introduced the fundamentals from a theoretical perspective, whereas 2, 4, 6, and 8 gave the students a chance to put that knowledge to the test. Sadly, it wasn't until the 9th part of the course that the restructuring principle was taught, and Percy would need 4 terms in total to master it if he went solely through the official route. I guess I can pick 10 and maybe 12 for some demonstrations. I'll have to cram the theory on my own in parallel. It wasn't going to be easy, but Percy was already a veteran alchemist. At any rate, this should be enough to wrap his mind around the topic. If not, he could practice more at home. Yet there was one more issue. Leo's never studied alchemy before. Will they even allow me to skip to 10? He'd have to ask. If they didn't let him, he'd have to study the topic on his own and pick runecrafting or affinities instead. Of course, he'd rather not, as neither of those seemed very useful for him, based on what he'd read. He sighed. It's barely been a day since I got here, and I'm already planning to pack my schedule full of work. At least, he didn't intend to study for cosmic studies outside of the classes. He didn't need to memorize anything for it either. Just learn some useful information that might come in handy in his future travels. That meant he only really had to split his time between alchemy and precasting for now. Well, mana flow too, but he'd yet to figure out how that one worked. Better prepare a little so that I'm not late tomorrow, he thought. Sifting through Leo's notebooks, he familiarized himself a little better with the list of topics his host had studied in the past. Sadly, most of them didn't interest him much. Picking out the notes on precasting 1 through 3, he placed them in his satchel for tomorrow. At the same time, he looked through the boys' stuff for any map or other reference he could use to actually find the place. Luckily, he did stumble upon a map of the building listing where each course took place. It also included other places of interest like the library or the cafeteria, where he hoped to get some more food tomorrow. Based on what he'd read in his host's diary, all students received some annual allowance from the academy, so he figured he should be able to buy food that way, though he'd have to observe the other students to understand how it all worked to avoid making a fool out of himself. Satisfied with his preparations, he switched off the lights, going to bed. As tough as the next few weeks promised to be, he was just as excited about precasting as he was about alchemy. Hopefully, I don't have to interact with any of Leo's friends much though. Chapter 258. Precasting. Aided by the map and his eagerness to begin his studies, Percy made it to the classroom early. By now, the first of the twin suns had fully emerged from its slumber, the other still bathing the sky in all sorts of vibrant hues as it slowly rose through the horizon. The room itself wasn't very large. It only contained 12 wooden desks, neatly arranged in 4 rows of 3. It reminded him a little of the place where he and Nesha had had their orientation, back during their first day in the guild. Though the desks all faced a yellowish board, smooth as glass. He'd no idea what people wrote on it with. I guess I'll find out soon. Sighing, he sat in one of the least conspicuous locations near the back of the room, right next to a window. Hopefully, the students weren't assigned specific seats, or he was about to piss somebody off. Propping his satchel against the wall, he took out the precasting 1 notebook, along with a food bag, placing them both on the desk. Opening the snack, he grabbed a handful of small, brown seeds, tossing them in his mouth. Unlike the Crimbian leaves he'd eaten the day before, he'd seen several mentions of these ranky beans in Leo's diary. Apparently, the boy had often had them for breakfast. "They're bitter," he blurted out, his features scrunching. "But I can see the appeal." The flavor would take some getting used to, but his half-closed eyes jolted wide open, the exotic snack instantly knocking the last traces of sleep out of his system. For a minute or two, he just sat in silence, watching the rest of the sunrise as he finished his meal. Only once he was done did he finally flip the notebook open, intending to do some last-minute reading before the other students arrived. Supposedly, he still had some time left. Let's see. So, precasting essentially involves priming your mana in preparation for a spell while it's still inside your core. The concept itself was relatively straightforward. An air user like Leo could potentially begin swirling their mana in advance, preparing to unleash a tornado from their hands. Or a fire user might raise the temperature of the mana inside their body to save time later when they shaped it into an attack. It also made it harder for one's opponent to realize what was going on, potentially catching them off guard. I wonder if I'd be able to see through this with my eyes. Following one of the training exercises in Leo's notebook, Percy tried to split the air mana in his core into 3 parts. When a mage wanted to shoot multiple projectiles, they'd normally separate the mana after it had already left their body. Splitting it from the core and drawing it out through different channels would lead to slightly faster spellcasting. Granted, the difference wasn't huge, just fractions of a second. Really, still a valuable advantage to have. Sadly, things didn't go smoothly. "This is harder than I thought." He creased his brow. Even the slightest perturbation had sent his mana into turmoil, making it difficult to grab a hold of. No wonder he'd never encountered this technique elsewhere. It sure seemed like an absolute pain to master, not that it was difficult to exert his will on the mana. In fact, the exact opposite was true. The problem was precisely that the mana was too responsive while in his core. Getting it to do as he wanted would need a delicate touch. And there was another issue. Percy was keenly aware that precasting wasn't very compatible with his current arsenal. Most of his spells involved either his mutated eyes, his bloodline, or constructs that took ages to craft. He currently lacked any spells that would immediately benefit from the technique, making it a little useless at the moment. If you encounter this narrative on Amazon, note that it's taken without the author's consent. Report it. It's still a handy trick to know. Maybe I can learn to form runes inside my cores after some practice. Obviously, he wasn't sure if that was even possible. Nothing he'd read had mentioned anything of the sort, but that just might be due to Felmara's runes not being suitable for the task. Or perhaps the difficulty involved was simply too staggering. After all, Percy already had his hands full with the basics, let alone shaping the mana into something as intricate as a rune and maintaining that for a long time. But if it works, the possibilities are endless. For instance, he could draw concealment runes to hide his second core from within, eliminating the need for an enchanted bandage or his armor. And who knew what else he'd come up with? "Leo!" a chirpy voice called out, snapping him out of his thoughts. So absorbed had he been in the exercise that he hadn't even noticed the newcomer. Good morning," he replied by instinct, trying to put a name to the girl's face. Olive-colored eyes, light brown hair, dimples when she smiled. He vaguely recalled his host calling her Lynn, though he wasn't certain that was her. If it was, she'd been mentioned several times in the diary too. Another close friend of his, no less so than Klatz. I should avoid calling her by name until I'm sure. Then again, talking to somebody who knew him so well was just as risky as getting her name wrong. His best course of action would be to keep his distance from her entirely. Sadly, that instantly became a great deal harder, as she opted to sit right next to him. Would it be rude if he moved elsewhere? With grave new empty setos. I'm glad you're taking classes again. She spoke again, oblivious to his thoughts. Do you still have trouble sleeping? Percy raised an eyebrow. Apparently, Leo's problem was a bit of an open secret. How should he even respond? Telling her he was fine would alleviate her worries for now, but they were still supposed to find him dead in his room a few weeks later. It was a little better last night, he said, carefully measuring his words. She looked like she wanted to say something else, but, fortunately, 2 more kids entered the room, cutting the conversation short. They both greeted them before taking their seats. One of them was even kind enough to say Lynn's name, verifying it was her. More people walked in shortly after, the classroom rapidly filling up with students. Some of them gave him the side eye again, others ignoring him entirely, just like yesterday. One of them appeared even more annoyed than the rest, glaring at him for a couple of seconds as he grumbled something illegible. The owner of the stolen desk, perhaps? Luckily, he didn't make a scene, sitting at one of the remaining spots instead. The teacher arrived too, a middle-aged man. His fur was pitch black, a green core thrumming in his chest. He wore similar robes to the students, though his were embroidered with a few intricate symbols, indicating his higher status. "Wanna grab lunch later?" Lynn whispered while the man unpacked his stuff on the desk. Percy deliberately ignored her, taking advantage of the fact the class was about to start. Internally, his mind was racing, however. He knew she'd ask him again later, and he had to think of a good excuse by then. Ahem. The teacher cleared his throat, gathering everyone's attention. As you all know, today's our last class this term. I've no idea how many of you intend to sit the exam at the end of the year, but here's a list of things you need to be proficient in, should you choose to do so. Turning around, he wrote on the yellow board with some kind of enchanted stick. Each stroke made a squeaky sound as it brushed against the smooth material, leaving a deep blue line in its wake. Every now and then, the man made a mistake, scrubbing the words out with the back of the stick. The students were silent, their eyes glued on the list of topics they'd have to revise by the end of the year. Clearly, most of them planned to sit the exam. Percy himself didn't care about that, but he still paid close attention, trying to get a clearer picture of the things he needed to catch up on. As soon as he was done, the teacher spoke again. By now, you should all feel very comfortable with the training exercises taught in the first 3 courses. I'm actually in charge of the next part too, and I hope to see all of you there in the next term. Obviously, you're not obligated to stick with the subject if you don't want to. Still, in my humble opinion, it would be a waste to drop it now that you've finally reached the best part. In Precasting 4, you'll have the opportunity to put everything you've learned into practice. The objective is to incorporate the technique into an actual spell. That is also the basis on which you will be examined at the end of the year, should you choose to take that exam too. Percy swallowed hard at the sound of that. The prospect of developing a new spell was exciting, but he didn't look forward to cramming 3 months of precasting exercises along with 2 months of alchemy theory. He sighed. Can't be helped, I suppose. Either I squeeze out the most valuable lessons the Academy has to offer, or I waste the trip. Chapter 259, Mana Flow. The next few hours were quite a slog. The lesson itself had been illuminating, cementing the idea in Percy's mind that precasting was a valuable technique to master. Even though it wasn't immediately applicable to his spells, he knew it was only a matter of time until he found a use for it. Sadly, he'd also made a complete fool of himself in front of the others. His classmates ran circles around him, practicing far more advanced exercises with ease. Meanwhile, he struggled with even the simplest tasks. "Cut me some slack, will you?" he grimaced. "You've been doing this crap for months. I only learned about this an hour ago." Currently, he was trying to stabilize the mana in his core. Normally, the air mana flitted about playfully, a key feature of this affinity. Suffice to say, forcing it to stand still went directly against its nature. Once mastered, it could potentially allow Percy to add a slightly different flavor to his wind spells than what air magic was traditionally known for. Passing the knowledge to Mickey might benefit him, but this wasn't why Percy had chosen this avenue to pursue. Rather, he figured that reigning in the wild aspects of air mana was good training for his eventual goal of forming stable runes inside his cores. "Son, I'll be blunt," the teacher said, watching his fumbling attempts with a disappointed frown. "Your current level won't cut it in Precasting 4. I suggest you drop the subject for now. If you're still interested, I'd recommend practicing on your own for a few terms and taking the course next year." Percy smiled bitterly, not disagreeing with the instructor's assessment. But this wasn't an option. He couldn't stay here that long. "Thanks for the honesty, sir. I'll do my best to make up for my deficiencies." The teacher sighed, moving to the next student. He offered him some words of encouragement, clearly more pleased with him. Though Percy couldn't shake the feeling there was more to the man's disapproval of him than merely his subpar performance. Don't tell me Leo managed to piss off the teachers too. It was around noon when the instructor ended the lesson, after reiterating the key points one last time. Percy ignored the pitying looks of his classmates, not letting his blunders weigh on him too heavily. He had expected nothing less out of his first day, given how abruptly he'd found himself thrust in the middle of the academic year. Besides, it wouldn't be his first time overcoming stacked odds. More importantly, I need to get the hell out of here while Lynn is still distracted, he reminded himself. He hurriedly packed up his belongings, stuffing everything into his satchel before slipping out the door. Fortunately, Lynn was busy chatting with a friend. Just as he thought he'd made a clean escape, however, someone intercepted him in the hallway. "Leo, are you free right now?" Klatz called. Percy frowned. These kids just wouldn't leave him alone. "Are you stalking me?" he asked dryly. Klatz flashed him a sheepish grin, rubbing the back of his head. "I wouldn't call it stalking. Look, I'm sorry if I came on too strong the other night. We're just worried about you. Me and Lynn both. You shouldn't let what happened last year ruin your whole life." Percy nodded, outwardly accepting the explanation while internally dissecting the boy's words. Truth be told, he knew something major had happened to his host at some point. From what he'd pieced together, Leo had once been a model student, smart, hardworking, and well-liked. Then, everything changed. As far as he could tell, it had something to do with mana flow. Unlike most other things the Academy taught, the technique required years to master. They had the students work on it throughout their studies, in parallel to the other courses. Occasionally, they brought in guest lecturers to demonstrate key parts of the technique, to allow the students to move on to the next step. The story has been illicitly taken. Should you find it on Amazon, report the infringement. Something must have gone wrong during one of those lectures. Percy had realized. Leo hadn't explicitly mentioned this in his diary, so it was largely speculation on Percy's part. Still, the signs were clear. Leo never wrote what happened on that day, but all the diary entries had noticeably shifted in tone since then. For one, he never even mentioned mana flow again. He withdrew from his friends, developed severe insomnia, and ignored his plummeting grades. Whatever had happened, it had chipped away at him emotionally, leading him down the spiral of addiction, ultimately causing his untimely death. "Thanks for caring," he said. "I guess I just haven't been feeling like myself lately, but the past few days have been different. You really don't have to worry about me." Before Klatz could respond, Percy was already moving past him. Unfortunately, the delay had given Lynn enough time to catch up. "Leo, are you running off again? Let's grab lunch and take a stroll through the garden. I really think some fresh air would do you good," she called out. Glancing back, he saw her giving him a pleading, puppy-eyed look. Klatz appeared no less concerned. Percy sighed. "Fine, but only for an hour. You heard the teacher. I have lots of work to do before next term starts. I hope I don't regret this," he thought to himself. "Should be fine, right?" This was an opportunity to learn how to get more food. And, if nothing else, he'd wanted to check the garden out since he first saw it. Percy followed Klatz and Lynn in silence as they led him to the cafeteria. Apparently, every student was entitled to at least one free meal per day. He wasn't sure about dinner, but at least he wouldn't have to rely solely on his host's dwindling stash of snacks. Even better, he figured out how to restock those too. The cafeteria had something called a vending machine where students scanned an enchanted card and selected items from a panel. "Ah, so that's what that thing was for," he realized, recalling a card like that among Leo's belongings. He hadn't brought it with him, so he'd have to return here later. He should check his remaining balance too. Hopefully, Leo had enough money to last through the term. Once they got their meals in paper boxes, Lynn practically dragged him outside, eager to make the most of their limited time. To his surprise, hanging out with them wasn't the worst thing. The kids were genuinely kind, as was everyone else he'd met so far. Well, maybe not towards him specifically, but in general, the garden was even prettier up close too. The flowers swayed softly under a gentle breeze, their fragrance filling the air. Percy inhaled deeply, committing the scent to memory. It wasn't often that his clones ended up somewhere nice. Walking along the cobblestone path, the trio quietly dug into their meals. Some pink noodles that tasted like cabbage, dipped in some spicy sauce and sprinkled with pieces of mincemeat. I wonder what happened in that lecture to derail Leo's life so completely. He just couldn't make sense of it. The academy seemed like the perfect place. Well-run and well-funded. Everyone was polite, and the curriculum was both accessible and rich in valuable knowledge. Leo had clearly been thriving here until that moment. "Is it true they're bringing in another guest lecturer at the end of next term?" a nearby student asked. The words sent a ripple of tension through the group. Lynn and Klatz exchanged worried glances, knowing this was a sour topic. They softly guided Percy away, careful not to let him overhear too much. Of course, Percy wanted to roll his eyes. He wasn't Leo, nor was he bound by his host's trauma. If anything, he was curious to find out more about this. Had he been alone, he would have stayed to listen. Instead, he had to let himself be pulled along, playing his role. "At any rate, I need to go to that lecture. Mana flow might be the most valuable thing to learn here." This wasn't empty speculation on his part either. He hadn't been able to find much on the topic, as the academy seemed to prefer that the students learned about it exclusively during the guest lectures. However, what little he'd learned had been plenty to pique his interest. Mana flow appeared to be another boosting art, bearing striking similarities to circulation. This was the first time Percy ever stumbled upon another spell like it, in fact. The reason it took students so long to master it was precisely because they had to train their bodies and clear their channels before they could even begin to practice it. With that in mind, Percy had finally pinpointed what had bugged him since he examined Leo's body. Apparently, the boy's mana channels were all tempered already, Suffice to say, he was used to having a complete mana network with his real body. 2 of them, in fact, but not his clones. That was why he'd subconsciously felt something out of place, though it hadn't really clicked until he made the connection. I should learn to use circulation with this body before then. It wouldn't be hard, as he already had everything he needed. His body was ready for it, and he even knew the correct pattern for the air affinity, having helped Mickey discover it. Obviously, he'd need a few days to adapt it to Leo's physiology, and to familiarize himself with it, but it shouldn't take as long as his other studies. If everything goes to plan, I might be able to merge the 2 spells. Chapter 260, Probationary Student. The next 6 days went by in a flash. Percy skipped both the geography and affinities classes, deciding his time was better spent preparing for the next term. Technically, it might have been a good idea to prioritize precasting, as he knew nothing about the topic. However, he chose to invest more than 80% of his waking hours into alchemy instead, for a very simple reason. My most urgent goal is to be allowed into the course in the first place. No matter how bad he was at precasting, nobody would object to him taking the 4th part after having just completed the 3rd one. However, he knew he'd inevitably be subjected to a lot of scrutiny when he tried to skip 9 alchemy courses at once. When that happened, he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. He needed to be able to answer any questions they asked. Consequently, he focused on familiarizing himself with the natives' tools, techniques, and ingredients to make the transition smoother. Still, what you're asking of me is unprecedented, the clerk responsible for course registration said. Obviously, it's not uncommon for students to skip a course. In fact, I've just allowed someone to jump 2 levels of history a couple days ago. But everything has to be within reason. Sir, I understand how odd this is, but I'm telling you I've studied the prerequisites in my own time. I honestly don't think I'll be at a disadvantage compared to the other students. The clerk shook his head, unconvinced. Kid, alchemy is one of the toughest subjects in the academy. Even the introductory courses are hellishly difficult. Very few students take the exams, and only a fraction of them pass. I promise you, if core cleansing pills weren't a gold mine and downright integral to our world's survival, nobody would bother with it. The man allowed his words to sink in as he adjusted his glasses. He wasn't very old, looking in his early 30s, an orange core thrumming in his chest. A Redborn, most likely. No wonder his eyesight hadn't improved yet. Not to mention, half the classes are practical. Do you expect me to believe you've turned yourself into an experienced alchemist simply by reading a few books? Percy sighed. I understand your misgivings, but I'm not lying. Are you seriously going to make me waste 9 terms to climb to my current level step by step? The man shrugged. It doesn't have to be 9. How about you start with Alchemy 4 directly? If you're as good as you claim, it should be a breeze. You can pick 8 next term and then 10 after that. I know it's not exactly what you've asked for, but you're still blitzing through one of the hardest courses in the academy in record speed. Truth be told, the clerk's suggestion was more than reasonable. Unfortunately, Percy couldn't possibly accept this, given his circumstances. Sir, with all due respect, why does the academy even care? I've never heard of anyone's course selection being rejected like this. Worst case scenario, I just embarrass myself. If that happens, I'll simply avoid taking the exam. No harm done. Admittedly, this was a bit of a bluff. While it was true he'd never heard of any such rumors, he'd only even been around a few days. Though he really hoped situations like this were truly rare, or he was about to get called out. Normally, we don't care. The man admitted, much to Percy's relief. But alchemy is an exception because the ingredients consumed in the practical classes are expensive and paid for by the academy. We're very careful about who we let in to prevent waste. Enjoying this book? Seek out the original to ensure the author gets credit. Another valid point. Percy knew firsthand how precious such resources were. But he wasn't going to back down so easily. Is there any way to prove my qualifications then? Perhaps if I can take a test? Or speak to one of the teachers in charge? The clerk grunted something illegible, rubbing his temples. Evidently, Percy had given him quite a headache. I can't even remember the last time we had to deal with a case like this, the clerk said, not bothering to hide his irritation. Getting up, he opened a cabinet behind him, sifting through a bunch of old documents. There, he spat, blowing the dust off a piece of paper. Fill this in. I'll register you as a probationary student. It'll be up to the teacher's discretion whether you get to stay there after the first 2 classes. You'll also need to put in a replacement course to automatically join if you get rejected. Percy nodded, his heart skipping a beat. Grabbing the document, he filled in all of Leo's details, writing Affinity 6 as an alternative. He'd already decided that runecrafting wouldn't help him much, so if it came to it, he'd have to make do with that. Let's not even entertain that possibility. I need to make sure I get accepted. Percy practically ran out of the office to not give the clerk a chance to change his mind. It's done. One of the hardest parts is over. Now I just have to convince the teacher to keep me there. Well, actually staying on top of his courses would also be one hell of a challenge, but he had a whole month to deal with that. Returning to his room, he found Klatz and Lynn waiting outside the door. Geez, they never give up, do they? He wrinkled his nose. Following their lunch a few days ago, Percy's friends had continued to visit him daily. Most of the time, he came up with various excuses to push them away. It helped that he was genuinely behind in his studies and had a lot of catching up to do. That said, he knew he couldn't always turn them down, lest they realized something was wrong. This put him in a difficult spot, as alienating his friends too much was just as risky as spending a lot of time with them. Consequently, he had to balance things out, agreeing to hang out once every few days just to get them off his back. Not that he disliked their company, Percy. They were good kids, fun to be around. But continuing to deceive them like this was not only distasteful, but a pointless drain on his limited time. Hey Leo, where were you? We've been waiting here for ages, Lynn said. Percy shrugged. I submitted my course selection. The girl raised an eyebrow upon hearing that. Are you changing courses? He nodded. From what he'd learned, students didn't need to visit the registration office otherwise. They were automatically registered for the next part of their current courses, assuming they all had one. I'm dropping geography and affinities for cosmic studies and alchemy. Seriously? Klatz jumped in. I thought you liked affinities. He looked a little annoyed about it, probably because he was also taking that course. I do. I might pick it up again later. Percy lied through his teeth, scrambling to come up with a believable excuse. I've always wanted to learn more about the cosmos. As for alchemy, well, everyone knows how lucrative it is. I thought it'd be nice to leave some doors open for after we graduate. The others looked at each other, apparently finding his reasons a little strange. Did he say something out of character? Maybe the boy had come from a rich family, making his worries about money redundant, or maybe he'd never shown any interest in the broader universe before. The possibilities were endless. I need to be more careful. Alas, he couldn't always dodge their questions. Besides, his courses weren't exactly a secret. They would have found out about them sooner or later. Fine, Klatz spat. Then I'll pick cosmic studies too. I was thinking of dropping painting anyway. Percy smiled wryly, unsure what to say to that. The guy was so clingy. In the end, he just chuckled along, telling him he looked forward to seeing him there. With Lynn also moving on to precasting 4, it would be just as difficult to avoid them next term. At least they can't follow me into Alchemy 10. He sighed, unlocking his door. Are you sure you don't want to grab dinner? Lynn asked. Sorry. I really need to get some more work done before classes start, he said, waving them off without even turning back. He knew they'd guilt-trip him into going if he did. Resting on the door, he allowed his weight to seal it shut. Lying to them is getting harder by the day. Alas, the part about having to study was true. Sitting at his desk, he picked up one of the alchemy books he'd borrowed from the library, resuming his work. Luckily, his first alchemy class was on sword day, so he still had some time for that. That said, the term was officially starting tomorrow. As for the subject, it was finally time to learn more about the stars above, as well as the myriad races living among them